Dead America, Tales from Las Vegas, The Conference, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1, 12:57 a.m., Nellis Air Force Base. Captain Foster sat outside General Morrison's office, waiting his turn to be seen. His 6-foot muscular frame strained against the structural integrity of the wooden chair, the joints creaking softly under his weight. The hallway stretched before him, sterile and dimly lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs that cast everything in an unforgiving white glow. It was highly unusual for the general to be requesting visitors at this hour of the night, but the activity happening in the main office was even more unusual. Through the glass partition that separated the waiting area from the command center, Foster could see dozens of people moving around the room with barely controlled urgency. The collection included military personnel in various states of dress uniform and civilian contractors clutching thick folders and electronic tablets. That wasn't all that concerned Foster. Several of them wore expressions that had no business being on the faces of trained professionals. Despite doing their best to remain steadfast and maintain military bearing, the fear was bleeding through their composed facades. The captain even noticed one young woman in civilian clothes fighting back tears as she bent over a computer terminal, her shoulders trembling slightly with each keystroke. "I don't know what this adds up to, but it can't be good," Foster muttered to himself, continuing to take in the chaotic scene before him. He tried to piece the situation together based on what they were doing. Military personnel were setting up detailed maps of the city across multiple folding tables, their surfaces covered with red pins and marker lines that formed patterns he couldn't decipher from his position. Civilian contractors were printing off reams of papers containing information he couldn't make out. The industrial printers running non-stop and filling the air with the smell of hot toner. Despite his best efforts and years of experience reading tactical situations, he couldn't figure out what kind of operation required this level of mobilization at nearly 1 in the morning. The captain sat straight up at attention as the door beside him opened with a sharp click. 2 soldiers stepped out, both looking like they'd seen something that had shaken them to their core. One of them glanced down in his direction, and as he spoke, Foster could see the bewildered look on the man's face, as if he was struggling to process whatever briefing he'd just received. "Captain Foster, the general is ready for you," the soldier said. "Thank you, soldier," Foster replied, pushing himself up from the chair. Foster got up, cracking his back after the lengthy stay on the uncomfortable seat. The joints in his spine popped audibly as he stretched, working out the kinks that had developed during his wait. He straightened his uniform, then gave a light knock on the open door to get Morrison's attention. "Come on in, Captain, and shut the door," General Morrison called from behind his desk without looking up from the paperwork spread before him. "Yes, sir," Foster responded. Foster stepped through the doorway, doing as instructed, before walking across the carpeted space toward the desk. The office was larger than most on base, with wood-paneled walls lined with commendations, unit photographs, and tactical maps of various theaters of operation. General Morrison sat behind an imposing oak desk that had probably seen decades of military service, its surface now covered with documents, manila folders, and what appeared to be satellite imagery. The general wore a weary expression that Foster had never seen on the man's face before. Morrison was known throughout the base as someone who thrived under pressure, the kind of officer who seemed to get calmer and more focused as situations became more critical. But tonight, the stress of something was clearly getting the best of him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually pristine uniform showed signs of hasty dressing. "Is everything okay, General?" Foster asked, concern evident in his voice. Morrison looked up from his paperwork, meeting Foster's eyes with a direct stare that carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "We're about as far away from okay as we can get," Morrison replied with grim finality. "Why don't you take a seat?" This offer put Foster even more at unease. While he had only met the general a few times over the last couple of years, he knew that Morrison had a reputation for being a bit of a hard ass. The man was known for keeping meetings brief and to the point, preferring to have subordinates stand at attention while receiving orders. The invitation to sit suggested this conversation was going to be anything but routine. As the captain lowered himself into the chair across from the desk, Morrison rifled around among his papers, searching for something specific. The general's movements were more hurried than his usual methodical precision, suggesting an urgency that made Foster's stomach tighten with apprehension. Finally, Morrison pulled out a small packet of papers that had been stapled together, the pages thick with typed names and identification numbers. "You need to get really familiar with these names, Captain, as everyone on that list is now officially your responsibility," Morrison said, sliding the packet across the desk. The captain picked up the papers and began flipping through them, his eyes scanning page after page of names arranged in neat columns. He shook his head as he reached the end of the document, the scope of whatever mission he was being assigned, becoming clearer but no less confusing. "General, I honestly don't know what to make of this," Foster admitted, holding up the papers. "There have to be over 100 names here." Morrison leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight. For a moment, the general seemed to be gathering himself, as if preparing to deliver information he still couldn't quite believe himself. "Well, Captain, an hour ago I got a call from D.C. informing me that the base is going to be evacuating," Morrison began, his voice carrying the tone of someone relaying orders he found difficult to accept. "Well, most of the base at any rate." Foster felt like he'd been struck by lightning. In all his years of military service, through multiple deployments and various crisis situations, he had never heard of an entire military installation being evacuated. The implications were staggering, and he struggled to process what the general was telling him. "Evacuate?" Foster asked, his voice rising slightly with disbelief. "What are you talking about, General?" "As of this moment, America is under attack," the general said. "Over the weekend, we got hit by a biological agent that has spread with no hope of containment. Within the next hour, the people it infected will be turning violent and attacking anyone within reach. Each hour that passes will mean more people turning." Foster remained silent, his mind reeling as he tried to process what he was hearing. He glanced side to side around the office, half expecting to spot a hidden camera or some other indication that this was an elaborate training exercise or psychological evaluation. The idea that his commanding officer was delivering a briefing about a biological attack that sounded like something out of a science fiction movie seemed too surreal to be genuine. "Is this a joke, General?" Foster asked, though something in Morrison's demeanor told him it wasn't. "It's anything but, Captain," Morrison replied with deadly seriousness. "By the time the sun comes up in the morning, this city and every city across the country is going to be overrun." "How do we stop it?" Foster asked. Morrison's expression grew even darker, if that was possible. "We don't," the general said simply. "It's infected 40% of the population, which is why we are evacuating, except for you and a few hundred of your comrades in arms. You're tasked with a vital mission." Foster looked down at the papers Morrison had handed him, understanding beginning to dawn as he connected the list of names to the mission the general was describing. "These people?" he asked, holding up the packet. "Those people, and a couple thousand just like them," Morrison confirmed. "Your mission is to round them up and get them to the college football stadium on the south side of town." Foster flipped through the pages again, trying to make sense of the logistics involved in what the general was asking him to do. "General, there has to be 150 names on this list," he said. "How are we supposed to track them all down before dawn?" Morrison leaned forward slightly, and for the first time since Foster had entered the office, something approaching relief crossed the general's features. "They're all staying at the same hotel," Morrison explained. "The Silver Moon Casino on the Strip. Every name on that list is an attendee at an engineering conference." "How are engineers going to help?" he asked. Morrison paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Most likely they're not, at least not for a while," the general admitted. "But the brass believes this is an apocalyptic event, and they've tasked us with saving as much brainpower as we can." Foster contemplated the words for a few moments, shaking his head in disbelief. The scope of what Morrison was describing seemed to expand with each new piece of information, and the implications were becoming more terrifying by the minute. "Jesus, this is unbelievable," Foster muttered, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "You better wrap your head around the situation, Captain, because it only gets worse," Morrison said with grim authority. "Now, one of my assistants out there will have an information packet with everything we know about the threat." "I'll be sure to grab one for my team," he confirmed. Morrison stood up from behind his desk, moving around to the front where he could look Foster directly in the eye. Be sure to stop by the armory and take whatever you deem necessary for the mission, the general instructed. Something in Morrison's tone suggested this wasn't a routine equipment requisition, and Foster found himself asking a question he never thought he'd pose to a commanding officer. "You make it sound like I should be loading up on ammo and high explosives," Foster said, half joking but increasingly concerned about the answer he might receive. Morrison stared at Foster for a long moment, his expression shifting subtly. When he spoke again, it wasn't with the voice of a commanding officer delivering orders to a subordinate. Instead, he spoke soldier to soldier, one combat veteran sharing hard-earned wisdom with another. "If it were me, Captain, I'd take everything I could carry and assume the worst," Morrison said quietly. Foster remained quiet for a moment, soaking in the statement and all its implications. The idea that a general was essentially telling him to prepare for a worst-case scenario involving civilians made his blood run cold. "One more thing, Captain," Morrison said as Foster started toward the door. "The first 4 names on that list, the ones in bold." Foster looked down at the papers, spotting the names that had been marked differently from the rest. "Those are the keynote speakers, top-level experts in a variety of specialties," Morrison explained. "The DC brass placed the highest priority on them." "I'll get them to the stadium safely," he promised. "I know you will, Captain," Morrison replied with confidence. "Good luck out there." The 2 men saluted each other with the formal precision that military protocol demanded, but Foster could see something in the general's eyes that suggested this might be the last time they would see each other. He turned and walked toward the office door, the weight of his new mission settling heavily on his shoulders. As he stepped back into the hallway, Foster spotted another soldier sitting in the same chair he had occupied earlier, waiting for his own briefing with the general. "I think it's your turn," Foster said to the waiting soldier. The man nodded and got up, keeping the rotation of briefings moving. As Foster walked through the main office area, weaving between the frantically working personnel, a young secretary approached him, carrying a single sheet of paper. "Captain, the general wanted you to have this threat assessment," she said, handing over the document. Foster took the paper and began scanning its contents as he walked. The more he read about things like headshots being the only effective means of stopping the infected, and how bites from the affected individuals were lethal, the more he began shaking his head in disbelief. "Wait, am I reading this right?" he asked, stopping in his tracks. "I'm afraid you are, Captain," the secretary confirmed, her voice carrying a mixture of professionalism and barely contained fear. "I know, it doesn't sound real, but this is straight from DC. "Okay, well, it looks like I'm going to take the general's advice and grab everything we can carry from the armory," Foster said, his voice carrying more conviction than he felt. "If you tell me what you need, I can radio them so they have it ready by the time you and your team get there," she offered. "Double the normal ammo loadout, grenades, and some high explosives with remote detonation," he said after a moment's consideration. The secretary's eyes went wide at the mention of explosives, her professional composure slipping for just a moment. The reaction prompted a chuckle from the captain, who understood how his request must sound. "Hey, the general said to plan for the worst and get what we needed, so that's what I'm doing," Foster explained with a slight smile. The secretary snapped out of her momentary shock, nodding in agreement as she regained her professional bearing. "Of course I'm sorry, Captain. It's just—" she began, then trailed off as if unsure how to voice her concerns. Foster picked up on her hesitation, understanding exactly what was troubling her. "It's just a grunt asking for enough explosives to level an off-strip casino sets off all kinds of alarm bells," he said with a smirk. The secretary let out a light laugh, and the moment of levity helped break some of the tension that had been building throughout the conversation. "Something like that, Captain," she admitted. "I'll radio them now. It should be ready within the half hour." "Excellent, thank you," Foster replied. Foster nodded his thanks as he headed toward the exit, his mind already shifting to the practical aspects of organizing his team and preparing for what promised to be the strangest mission of his military career. As he stepped out into the night air, he looked around at the base, taking in the unusual level of activity for such a late hour. Personnel were moving with purpose between buildings, vehicles were being loaded with equipment, and there was an underlying sense of urgency that permeated everything. He had been part of emergency mobilizations before, but this felt different, There was an edge to the activity, a barely controlled panic that suggested everyone involved understood they were dealing with something unprecedented. Foster soaked it all in for a moment, trying to prepare himself mentally for whatever lay ahead. The night air was cool against his face, a stark contrast to the heated atmosphere inside the command building. In the distance, the lights of Las Vegas glittered like fallen stars, completely unaware of what was about to descend upon the city. The boys are never going to believe this. Chapter 2. Captain Foster sat behind the wheel of an oversized SUV, navigating his team through the darkened streets of Las Vegas. The vehicle's engine hummed steadily as they moved deeper into the city, passing beneath streetlights that cast intermittent pools of yellow light across the asphalt. The dashboard clock glowed red in the darkness, showing they were already pushing past 2 a.m. To his right, riding shotgun, was Sergeant Hansen, who had been his second in command through 3 tours in the sandbox. Short, stocky, and bearing the distinctive burn scars on his right arm from an IED blast 2 years prior, the sergeant had always been known for speaking his mind, regardless of rank or circumstance. Hansen held the threat assessment paper in his hands, squinting at it in the dim interior lighting as he tried to make sense of what he was reading. "The general can't be serious with this," Hansen said, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and concern. "We have to go to the strip and shoot civilians in the head if they run towards us." Behind Hansen sat Corporal Sullivan, his tall, lanky build making it easy for him to reach up and grab the paper from the sergeant's hand. Sullivan had the kind of height that made him look perpetually uncomfortable in military vehicles, his knees pressed against the back of the front seat. "Come on, you have to be reading that wrong, Sarge," Sullivan said, taking the document and holding it closer to the overhead light. Sullivan angled the paper so the 3 other soldiers in the rear of the vehicle could read over his shoulder. The cramped space forced them to huddle together as they examined the threat assessment that had come directly from D.C. Private Cooper occupied the seat behind Foster, and he looked like he'd been pulled straight from central casting for a middle American farm boy. Tall, muscular, and blonde, with the kind of clean-cut features that belonged on military recruitment posters. His Iowa accent became more pronounced when he was stressed, which was becoming apparent as he read through the document. "Sorry, Sarge, but it says right there, headshots are the only thing to put these crazy people down," Cooper said. Private Thomas was the exact opposite of Cooper in almost every way. Short, stocky with a completely shaved head, he carried himself with the compact efficiency of someone who'd learned to make up for his lack of height with aggressive competence. He leaned over Sullivan's shoulder to get a better look at the document. "Frankly, I'm more concerned with the biting," Thomas said. Private Parker was somewhere in the middle of his teammates in terms of physical characteristics. Average height, brown hair, and regular features that wouldn't stand out in a crowd. If it wasn't for the combat gear he was wearing and the assault rifle across his lap, he'd look like any of the hundreds of thousands of tourists who wandered the streets of Sin City every day. "I had a cousin back home that was a biter," Parker said with a chuckle. "Always had to fight with my parents when they demanded I babysit the little bastard." Sullivan continued scanning the document, his expression growing more troubled with each line he read. "The blood type thing is crazy too," Sullivan observed. "That's gotta be what? Half the base with that kind of blood." Foster had been listening to his men process the information while keeping his attention focused on the road ahead. The streets were unusually quiet for Las Vegas at this hour, with minimal traffic and very few pedestrians visible on the sidewalks. Something about the emptiness felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what was bothering him about it. "All right, that's enough chatter," Foster said, his command voice cutting through their discussion. "We're already pushing 2 o'clock, and if half the stuff on that paper is really happening out here, then we have our work cut out for us." The men settled down immediately. Foster had always been able to command respect without raising his voice, and his team knew that when he spoke in that tone, it was time to focus on the mission. "We're a few minutes out from the strip," Foster continued, checking his mirrors as he navigated through a largely empty intersection. "So, let's run through it again. Sergeant, when we arrive, we hit a side entrance to keep panic down and head to the front desk," Hansen recited. "We get the rooms of the VIPs and get them ready to move." Foster nodded approvingly as they passed beneath another streetlight, the vehicle's headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. Good. Corporal Sullivan? When we reach the casino, Private Cooper and I will take the vehicle down to the city bus terminal and borrow one for transport, Sullivan said. It's on the far north side of town, and if everything goes smoothly, we should be parked by the parking deck within an hour. Good. Private Thomas, what's after that? Thomas shifted in his seat, his compact frame allowing him more comfort in the cramped rear space than his taller companions. Once we get word the transport is on site, we move the civilian VIPs through the casino into the parking deck, get them loaded up and head out, Thomas replied. We move fast like we have a purpose, and we'll be able to watch the sun come up over the city from the friendly confines of the stadium, Foster said, with more confidence than he felt. As they drove down the strip, Foster couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the scene around them. The famous street was eerily quiet, with far less traffic than he'd ever seen. He ignored the unsettling observations as he spotted the Silver Moon Casino up ahead on the right, its facade lit with the kind of gaudy display that had made Las Vegas famous. The building rose several stories into the night sky, its exterior covered with lights that promised excitement and fortune to anyone willing to step inside. And remember, no unnecessary hostile actions, Foster said as they approached their destination. We're not exactly supposed to be operating on American soil, so the less attention we bring to ourselves, the better. That said, if it does become necessary to be hostile, make them regret that they came our way. The men let out an affirmative grunt that Foster had heard countless times over the years. The sound was reassuring in its familiarity, a reminder that despite the unusual nature of their current mission, his team remained the same professional soldiers he'd trained and fought alongside for years. Foster pulled the SUV up to the side of the casino's parking deck. The parking structure was a massive concrete edifice that rose several levels above the street, its interior largely hidden in shadow. Corporal Sullivan moved around to the driver's side, while Private Cooper took the passenger seat as the others got out. We'll be back before you know it, Captain, Sullivan said. And we'll be ready for you when you get here, Foster replied, stepping back from the vehicle. Sullivan nodded before hitting the gas and taking off down the street, the SUV's taillights disappearing as he turned and vanished around a corner. The sound of the engine faded quickly, leaving Foster and his remaining men standing in the unusual quiet of the Las Vegas night. The rest of the men gathered around Foster, their boots echoing softly on the concrete as they formed up for the next phase of their operation. Foster slung his rifle onto his shoulder while undoing the safety latch on his sidearm holster. Let's get inside, Foster instructed. Stay to the outer edges of the gaming floor. The men nodded their understanding as Foster led them into the parking deck, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space as they made their way toward the covered walkway that connected the structure to the main casino. The parking deck was largely empty with only scattered vehicles occupying spaces throughout the massive structure. As they reached the walkway and entered the casino proper, they were struck by the contrast between the quiet street outside and the interior of the Silver Moon. The loud sounds coming from hundreds of slot machines created a constant symphony of electronic chimes, bells, and musical stingers that filled the air with the promise of instant wealth. Despite the cacophony from the gaming machines, there weren't that many people wandering around the casino floor or actively gambling. The few patrons Foster could see appeared to be the hardcore night owls who treated gambling as a marathon rather than a sprint, hunched over their chosen machines with the single-minded focus of true addicts. As Foster led his team around the perimeter of the gaming floor, staying close to the walls to avoid drawing attention, a couple of security guards spotted them. The guards were both middle-aged men, wearing the standard uniform of casino security, and they gave the armed soldiers a careful once-over before nodding in their direction with what appeared to be approval. I guess they like the military, Hansen observed quietly. Or don't get paid enough to confront four nut jobs who look like they're loaded up to invade a small nation, Parker replied with a laugh. The front desk area was largely empty except for a lone woman working behind the marble counter. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail and wearing the standard uniform of hotel staff. Her name tag identified her as Melody, and she looked up from her computer terminal as the four armed soldiers approached her station. "Good evening, gentlemen," Melody said, with the practiced cheerfulness of someone trained in customer service. "I'm sorry to inform you that the Silver Moon Casino has a strict no-invasion policy. Foster had to admire her composure in the face of 4 heavily armed men approaching her desk in the middle of the night. Most civilian employees would have been reaching for the panic button or diving for cover. "Cute, but we need your help," Foster replied, keeping his voice level and professional. Melody's expression shifted slightly, her customer service smile taking on an edge that suggested she wasn't as intimidated as most people would be in her situation. "You need my help?" she said, crossing her arms. "Good luck with that." Melody clearly wasn't thrilled to have 4 armed men standing in her lobby, and she was making her displeasure very apparent. Foster decided to try the direct approach, pulling out the sheet of VIP names and placing it on the counter in front of her. "We know these people are staying here, we just need their room numbers," Foster explained, sliding the paper toward her. Melody picked up the list and began scanning through the names, her expression changing as she recognized several of them from recent check-ins. After a moment, she shook her head and set the paper back down on the counter. "So, you want me to violate their privacy so that you can—" "What?" Melody challenged. "Help me out here." "Look, I'll level with you," Foster said, deciding that honesty might be more effective than military authority. "There's been a biological attack on the country, and we have to escort every person on that list to safety." Melody's eyes narrowed as she processed his words, her expression shifting from mere annoyance to something approaching anger. "And leave the plebes like me behind?" she said, her voice rising slightly. "I don't think so. Half the people on that list are college kids. I checked them in myself. If they're worthy of being saved, then so am I." Before Foster could respond to her demand, Sergeant Hansen decided to take matters into his own hands. Without warning, he vaulted over the counter with surprising agility for his stocky build, landing hard beside Melody with his boots hitting the carpet behind the desk, with a solid thud. Rather than back down or show fear at having an armed soldier suddenly invade her workspace, Melody stood her ground and stared him down with the kind of defiance that suggested she'd dealt with difficult customers before. "We don't have time for this," Hansen said. Hansen reached down and grabbed the key card from Melody's hand, swiping it on the keypad beside the computer terminal. The system responded with a loud beep, but instead of granting access, a prompt appeared on screen requesting an employee identification number. Hansen turned to Melody expectantly, but she responded with the kind of satisfied customer service grin that appeared when difficult customers received their comeuppance. "Nice try, hotshot, but if you want the info, you're going to need my code," Melody said with obvious satisfaction. She paused for a moment, letting the reality of the situation sink in before continuing with her demands. "Now, you either agree to take me with you, or you can have fun knocking on 1,000 doors to find the people you want." Melody continued, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who held all the cards. "Assuming you get that far, because I'm 100% calling the police the second you're away from the desk." Hansen looked over to Foster, recognizing that they had been bested. Finally, Foster gave Hansen a reluctant nod. "Okay, you can come with us," Foster said, "but you're going to help us every step of the way." Melody's expression brightened, and she put on her customer service smile as she stepped up to the computer terminal. She yanked her keycard out of Hansen's hand before typing her employee identification code into the system. The screen came to life, displaying the hotel's guest management system in all its complexity. Melody's fingers flew across the keyboard with the kind of speed that came from years of working with the same software system. The process went on for what felt like much longer than the 30 seconds it actually took, with Foster growing increasingly impatient as he watched Melody work. "Any time now, Melody," Hansen said from his position behind the counter. "You can settle your ass down there," Melody replied without looking up from her work. Foster decided to intervene before the situation between his sergeant and their reluctant ally could escalate further. "Time is of the essence, Melody," Foster said, keeping his voice level but allowing some urgency to show through. "I figured as much, which is why I'm printing out everyone's room number for you," Melody replied, her fingers still moving across the keyboard. "How did you do that so fast?" Parker asked. Melody looked up from the computer with a large grin across her face. "Every name I recognized from the list are part of the engineering conference that's taking place here," she explained. "They got a group rate, so I was able to pull up their reservations that way." Melody grabbed the printed pages from the machine and tossed them onto the counter where Foster could review them. "They're all on the 14th and 15th floors," Melody continued. "If you'll give me a minute, I'll make up some universal keycards for the doors." Foster felt some of the tension leave his shoulders as their mission suddenly became much more manageable. "Thank you, Melody," he said. As Melody worked on programming the keycards, she continued talking without looking up from the card programmer on the desk. "So, if they're sending soldiers to invade casinos, I'm guessing that whatever was released was bad," she asked, her tone shifting from confrontational to concerned. Foster's expression grew serious as he considered how much information to share with their civilian ally. "It has the potential to be world-ending," Foster said quietly. Melody froze for a moment, her hands stopping their work as she looked up to study Foster's face. Whatever she saw there convinced her that he wasn't exaggerating or trying to manipulate her. The gravity of the situation seemed to settle over her like a physical weight. She gave him a slow nod before returning to her work, but now her movements carried a new urgency that matched their own. After another moment of focused work, Melody held up 4 programmable key cards, each one capable of opening every room in the hotel. "If that's the case, then we better get a move on." Chapter 3. Corporal Sullivan drove himself and Private Cooper through the darkened back roads of Vegas, leaving the Strip and its neon glow far behind as they ventured into the northern part of the city. The transition from the tourist corridor to the working neighborhoods was stark. Gone were the towering casino facades and endless streams of traffic, replaced by strip malls, apartment complexes, and the kind of utilitarian buildings that kept a city functioning behind the scenes. "Come on, where the hell is this place?" Sullivan muttered, squinting through the windshield as he scanned both sides of the road. Cooper leaned forward in the passenger seat, studying the street signs and building numbers as they passed. "I think we need to go north another couple of blocks," Cooper suggested. Sullivan shot him a look of frustration. "I thought you said that it was on this road." Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing his earlier confidence had been misplaced. "Clearly I was wrong," he admitted. Sullivan shook his head as he made a right turn toward the north, the SUV's headlights sweeping across empty sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. Most of the businesses they passed appeared to be closed for the night, their parking lots empty and their windows dark. They stopped at the next intersection, both men looking left and right in an attempt to spot the bus depot among the scattered commercial buildings. The area was eerily quiet, with no other vehicles on the road and no sign of pedestrians anywhere. After seeing nothing but closed businesses and empty lots, Sullivan drove north another block, their mission clock ticking away precious minutes. "All right, we're in business," Cooper said with relief. Cooper pointed out the window to their right, where a large metal fence stood 8 feet tall and stretched for what appeared to be an entire city block. The chain-link barrier was topped with razor wire and enclosed a sprawling lot filled with the distinctive shapes of municipal buses. "Good eye, Cooper," Sullivan said, turning the vehicle toward their target. Cooper couldn't resist a small moment of vindication. "I told you it was around here," he said. Sullivan navigated the SUV down the street toward the depot entrance. "Yeah, not sure saying it's in the north is enough directions to claim victory," Sullivan replied dryly. "But since the world is apparently ending, I'll let you have this one." Cooper let out a chuckle as they approached the corner of the lot, the SUV's engine noise echoing off the surrounding buildings in the quiet night air. The depot was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with dozens of buses parked in neat rows throughout the fenced area. As they reached the corner of the lot, their engine noise drew the attention of a figure standing near the front gate about 40 yards ahead of them. At first glance, it appeared to be a security guard or maintenance worker, but something about its posture and movement seemed wrong. The figure wandered toward the sound of their approaching vehicle, its movements jerky and unsteady as it struggled to locate the source of the noise that had drawn it from whatever shelter it had been occupying. The person moved like someone who was injured or disoriented, stumbling slightly as it turned in their direction. It took a moment for the figure to spot the SUV, but once it did, everything changed. In a startling transformation, it began sprinting toward their vehicle with a speed and aggression that caught both soldiers off guard. "Sullivan, what in the hell is that?" Cooper asked, his voice rising with alarm. "I don't know, Private," Sullivan replied, his training kicking in as he reached for his sidearm. Sullivan's movement prompted Cooper to draw his own weapon, both men preparing for a confrontation they didn't understand. The running figure covered the distance between them with frightening speed, its sprint ending when it slammed directly into the front grille of the SUV. The impact was substantial enough to rock the entire vehicle backward, causing both men to brace themselves against their seats. Through the windshield, they found themselves face to face with something that had once been human, but clearly wasn't anymore. The creature before them wore the tattered remains of a city worker's uniform, the fabric torn and stained with dark patches that could only be blood. Its eyes held no recognition or intelligence, just a vacant stare that seemed to look through them rather than at them. The thing's mouth hung open, producing a low moaning sound that was audible even over the SUV's engine. Its hands smacked against the front hood with mechanical persistence, leaving bloody handprints on the metal as it tried to claw its way toward the vehicle's occupants. The two soldiers stared at the zombie in horrified fascination, unsure of what they were witnessing. "Should I, pop it in the head?" Cooper asked, his voice uncertain. Sullivan continued staring at the creature, his attention drawn to the grievous neck wound it had suffered. The injury was severe enough that it should have been fatal, a deep gash that exposed tissue and bone beneath. Yet here the thing stood, very much active and trying to rip them apart. "Yeah, I think that might be a good idea, Cooper," Sullivan said after a moment. Cooper rolled down his window and leaned out, taking careful aim with his sidearm. The zombie's head was only a few feet away, making it an easy target even in the dim lighting. With a squeeze of the trigger, his bullet tore through the creature's forehead, sending blood and brain matter spraying across the asphalt. The zombie dropped like a marionette with its strings cut, its body crumpling to the ground beside their vehicle. But before Cooper could retreat back into the safety of the SUV, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Moaning sounds were coming from several directions around them, quickly followed by the sound of running footsteps on pavement. "Christ, there's more of them!" Cooper shouted. "Hang on," Sullivan replied, slamming the SUV into drive. Sullivan hit the gas, speeding toward the entrance of the bus depot as their mission became even more urgent. As they approached the gate, half a dozen creatures emerged from the shadows around the entrance, all of them focusing on the speeding vehicle with predatory intent. Sullivan didn't slow down or attempt to avoid them. Instead, he cut the wheel hard to his left and plowed straight through the group of zombies. Bodies flew through the air as the SUV's momentum carried them forward, the occupants bouncing around inside the cab as the vehicle's wheels crushed several creatures beneath them. The impacts were sickening, but Sullivan kept his foot on the accelerator until they were clear of the immediate threat. Once past the entrance, he sped toward the main office building, a small three-room structure sitting in the middle of the lot, surrounded by dozens of dark, idle city buses. "Get ready to move and get that door open," Sullivan ordered. "I'm on it, Sullivan," Cooper replied, checking his weapon and preparing to exit the vehicle. Sullivan slammed on the brakes, bringing the SUV to a skidding halt just beside the front entrance of the office building. By the time he had cut the engine, Cooper was already outside and running toward the door, his rifle held at the ready. Sullivan stepped out of the vehicle and slung his rifle into a firing position, just as he heard the familiar sounds of moaning and footsteps coming from the front entrance to the lot. He looked back to see half a dozen more creatures emerging from the darkness, apparently drawn by the commotion of their arrival. The zombies spotted Sullivan and locked onto him with frightening focus, breaking into a coordinated sprint in his direction. "Get that door open, Cooper!" Sullivan shouted over the growing noise of the approaching horde. Sullivan raised his rifle and took aim as best he could in the poor lighting conditions. The scattered streetlights made it difficult to get a clear sight picture on the creatures' heads, but he squeezed off a controlled, 3-round burst anyway. His bullets found their target, catching the lead zombie in the face and head. The creature dropped instantly, but the pack continued gaining ground on his position. The remaining ghouls were now within 30 yards of Sullivan, who began backing toward the office building while continuing to fire. He took aim again and sent another 3-round burst toward the closest creature. The rounds hit their mark, dropping the zombie to the ground and causing it to trip up several of the others behind it. Sullivan glanced over his shoulder and saw Cooper still struggling with the office door. "Get out of the way, Cooper!" Sullivan called out. Cooper did as instructed, stepping aside as Sullivan approached the entrance. Sullivan raised his rifle and fired half a dozen rounds at the door's locking mechanism, the high-velocity bullets shredding the metal hardware and allowing the door to swing open. Both soldiers burst through the doorway and slammed it shut behind them, their breath coming in short gasps from the adrenaline and exertion. "Hold the door," Sullivan ordered. Cooper nodded and put his back against the door, planting his feet firmly on the ground and pushing back with everything he had. Sullivan ejected his spent magazine and inserted a fresh one, preparing for the inevitable assault on their position. The first 3 zombies reached the door and slammed into it with enough force to make Cooper strain against their combined weight. He groaned as more creatures pressed against the backs of the others, creating a growing pile of bodies trying to break through their barrier. "Any time now, Sullivan," Cooper grunted, his muscles burning from the effort of keeping the door closed. Sullivan positioned himself a few feet away from the entrance and began firing single shots through the door, aiming through the glass at the creatures' heads. One by one, the zombies dropped to the ground as his bullets found their marks. Within seconds, the threat was neutralized, with half a dozen bodies lying motionless just outside the office building. Cooper continued pressing against the door, not wanting to risk opening it until he received confirmation that the area was secure. Sullivan stepped up to the damaged entrance and peered carefully through the bullet holes in the spider-webbed glass. He studied the front of the lot, noting that a couple of the zombies he had run over with the SUV were still moving, though they appeared unable to stand. "Jesus, Cooper, you gotta see this," Sullivan said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Sullivan helped Cooper up from his position against the door, and the private rubbed his sore thighs where the constant pressure had taken its toll. When Cooper looked through the damaged glass and saw the creatures still trying to move, despite being run over by their vehicle, he let out an audible gasp. "You know, Sullivan, I'm beginning to think the general was underselling just how much shit we're in," Cooper said, staring at the persistent zombies. "No kidding," Sullivan agreed. Cooper turned away from the disturbing sight and looked around the small office space they had taken shelter in. "So, what do we do now?" he asked. "We need to tear this place apart and find some keys, then get back to the captain," Sullivan said with resolve. "Because I don't know about you, but I don't want to be out here any longer than I need to be." Chapter 4. Captain Foster walked down the hallway of the 14th floor of the hotel, his boots silent on the plush carpeting as he moved between the rooms they'd already visited. Behind him, a few dozen people stood in their doorways, some fully dressed and ready to leave, others still in various states of undress as they tried to process what was happening. Private Parker and Melody were working their way through the remaining rooms, speaking with the conference attendees and trying to calm down those who were agitated about being woken up in the middle of the night. "It's 3:30 in the damn morning," a man shouted from one of the doorways. "Why are you banging on my door?" Parker positioned himself in front of the angry guest, trying to maintain his composure in the face of civilian hostility. "Sir, I need you to calm down. There's an emergency and you need to—" Parker began, but was cut off by the man's escalating voice. The man's raised tone put the young soldier on edge, and several of the other guests who had been standing quietly in their doorways began shifting nervously as they watched the confrontation unfold. "The only thing I need to do is go back to bed," the man declared, his voice echoing down the hallway. The man stepped back into his room and attempted to shut the door, clearly intent on ignoring whatever emergency the soldiers claimed was taking place. Before the door could close, Melody planted her foot firmly inside the room, blocking it from shutting. The man looked down at her with open contempt, his face flushing with anger. "You have 3 seconds to move that foot or else I'm going to have your job," he threatened. Melody leaned in close, her voice dropping to a low but forceful tone that carried more authority than her hotel uniform would suggest. "Fine, go back in your room and go to sleep while the rest of your convention goers are evacuated to safety," she said, her words cutting through his bluster. "Then, when you wake up and realize it's too late, you can spend your last minutes on this planet reveling in the fact that you really showed a front desk clerk who was boss." The man was visibly taken aback by her response, looking around to some of the other conference attendees who had been watching the exchange. Several of them nodded at him, their faces showing concern as they silently pleaded for him to cooperate with the evacuation. After a few tense moments, the man let out a frustrated grunt and stepped aside. "Yeah, fine, whatever. I'll get some clothes on and be out in a minute, he muttered. That's more like it, Melody replied, stepping back out into the hallway and allowing the man to close his door. She looked over to Private Parker with a slight shrug, as if the confrontation had been routine rather than threatening. It's not my first time dealing with rude assholes, she explained matter-of-factly. I can see that, Parker replied with admiration. Before they could continue with the next room, Foster's voice carried down the hallway. Parker, Melody, I need you down here, the captain called out. The two of them broke away from their current position, looking over to the remaining conference attendees who were still standing in their doorways with bewildered expressions. Please, all of you go back inside and get ready. We're going to be leaving here shortly, Parker instructed. The people did as they were told, retreating into their rooms as Parker and Melody made their way down the hall toward Foster, who was standing motionless outside one of the doors, with his head tilted at an angle that suggested he was listening intently to something. What's up, Cap? Parker asked as they approached. Foster held up his hand for silence before responding. Tell me what you hear, he said quietly. Parker and Melody moved closer to the door, tilting their heads and straining to pick up whatever sounds had caught the captain's attention. It took them a moment to filter out the ambient noise from the other rooms, but eventually they detected faint sounds coming from behind the door. There was a low moaning noise, almost like someone in pain, accompanied by a wet slurping sound that was difficult to identify, but distinctly unpleasant. I don't know what I'm hearing, Parker admitted, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. Melody reached into her pocket and pulled out one of the master key cards, holding it out toward Foster. You can knock or you can use this, she suggested. Foster took the key card and looked at it for a moment, weighing his options as he tried to decide on the best course of action. Before approaching the door, he pulled out his combat knife and held it at the ready. Parker, I need you to cover me, Foster ordered. The young soldier nodded and took up a position behind the captain, his sidearm drawn and ready. Foster stepped up to the door and swiped the key card, the electronic lock responding with a beep as the deadbolt mechanism disengaged with a solid thunk. Foster gently pushed the door open, but before he could step inside or even get a clear view of the room's interior, the sound of rapid footsteps came racing toward the doorway. As the door swung wide and hit the backstop on the wall, Foster found himself face to face with a creature that had once been human, but was now something else entirely. The creature let out a wet moan, a piece of torn flesh falling from its mouth as it reached out for the captain with grasping hands. Foster managed to raise his arm and plant it against the zombie's chest, but the impact and momentum of the creature's charge drove him backward into the hallway. Foster stumbled, his feet becoming entangled with the zombie's legs, and both of them crashed to the carpeted floor, with Foster landing hard on his back. Within seconds, the zombie was on top of him, thrashing about wildly as it tried to grab onto the soldier with blood-slicked hands. Foster managed to grab onto the creature's shirt, holding it at arm's length as he struggled to position his knife for a killing strike. Before Foster could deliver the blade to the zombie's head, a gunshot echoed throughout the hallway as Private Parker squeezed the trigger on his sidearm. The bullet tore into the side of the creature's skull, sending blood and brain matter spraying across the hallway wall as the zombie tumbled sideways off the captain. "Are you okay, Cap?" Parker asked, moving forward to help his commanding officer. Foster was momentarily stunned by the close call, taking a moment to shake off the adrenaline as Parker helped him back to his feet. The captain looked down at the motionless body on the carpet, the reality of how close he had come to death beginning to sink in. "Yeah, I'm good, Parker. Thanks for the assist," Foster replied, brushing off his uniform. "Anytime, Cap. That's why I'm here," Parker said. The three of them stood in the hallway, catching their breath and trying to process what had just happened when they heard movement coming from the still-open hotel room. They turned their attention back to the doorway and spotted another zombie stumbling out from the area near the beds. This creature was in even worse condition than the first, missing several large chunks of flesh from its face and torso, with dark blood staining what remained of its clothing. It took the ghoul a moment to orient itself and locate the source of the noise in the hallway, but once it spotted them, it let out a horrific moan that seemed to come from deep in its chest. The zombie began racing toward them, with the same frightening speed as the first one. Parker reacted on pure instinct, raising his handgun and firing several rounds in rapid succession. His marksmanship left something to be desired under the stress of combat, however, and his bullet struck the creature in the torso rather than the head. One shot managed to hit its shoulder, spinning the zombie around and slowing its forward momentum long enough for Melody to spring into action. The desk clerk darted forward and grabbed onto the door handle, pulling the door shut just before the creature could reach the threshold. A second later, the zombie slammed into the closed door with enough force to rattle the frame, then began pounding against it as it tried to break through the barrier. "Nice work," Foster said. "I just didn't think we needed more company in the hallway," Melody replied. Before Foster could respond to her quick thinking, they heard the distinct sound of several doors slamming shut from further up the hallway. The gunshots and commotion had apparently spooked some of the conference attendees. 3 people emerged from 2 different rooms, hastily dressed and moving with a kind of panic that overrode rational thought. Instead of approaching the soldiers for guidance, they ran away from them as fast as they could, heading toward the far end of the hallway. "You need to stop right now," Foster shouted after them. The fleeing civilians didn't listen to his command, continuing their sprint toward the emergency stairwell door at the end of the corridor. Their fear had taken control, and they weren't thinking about the consequences of abandoning the protection of armed soldiers. "Parker, get after them," Foster ordered. "I'm on it, Cap," the private replied, taking off in pursuit. Parker ran down the hallway, his longer stride allowing him to gain ground on the trio. But they had too much of a head start. By the time he reached the stairwell door, the civilians had already pushed through and were descending the concrete steps. Parker burst through the door and into the stairwell, the sound of the fleeing civilians' footsteps echoing off the concrete walls as they made their way down toward what they hoped was safety. Before Parker could begin his pursuit, the sound of footsteps was joined by screams that cut through the air like knives. The private moved to the metal railing and stuck his head over the edge, looking down through the middle section of the stairwell as he tried to locate the source of the screaming. The acoustics of the enclosed space made it difficult to pinpoint exactly which floor the sounds were coming from. He didn't have to wait long for clarification. One of the fleeing civilians suddenly appeared over the railing several floors below, driven by what appeared to be another person in a violent tackle. The man screamed as he tried to grab onto the railing to arrest his fall, but only managed to grab onto the zombie that was attacking him. The sound of bodies and limbs smacking against metal railings and concrete surfaces filled the stairwell as both figures plummeted toward the ground floor far below. The impacts echoed upward through the enclosed space, creating a horrifying soundtrack to the violence. A few moments later, Parker heard one set of footsteps racing back up the stairs toward his position, but they were being pursued by several matching sets of footfalls that suggested the survivor wasn't alone. Parker readied his rifle and aimed it down at the dimly lit landing just below his position, waiting for whatever was coming up the stairs to come into view. A man eventually emerged into Parker's line of sight, trying to make the turn toward the private's floor, but he was moving too fast and stumbled on the last step. The civilian fell hard onto the concrete landing and was pounced on by several zombies that had been chasing him up the stairwell. "Jesus Christ!" Parker exclaimed. Parker aimed his rifle at the mass of writhing bodies, trying to pick out a clean target, but the flailing limbs of both the creatures and the civilian made it nearly impossible to get a clear shot without risking hitting the victim. A moment later, another zombie came around the corner below, but instead of joining the feeding frenzy on the ground, it focused its attention on Parker standing at the railing above. Parker reacted swiftly, sending a controlled 3-round burst into the creature's head. The bullets tore through skull and brain matter, spraying blood across the stairwell wall as the zombie collapsed backward onto the concrete steps. The sound of gunfire drew the attention of the feeding ghouls below, and Parker could see them beginning to disengage from their victim and look upward in his direction. Parker muttered curses under his breath as he quickly backed away from the railing and headed for the stairwell door. He pulled it shut behind him just as he heard the sound of multiple creatures beginning to climb the stairs toward his position. "Captain, we're in trouble." Chapter 5. Private Parker stood by the stairwell door, backing up a few steps while keeping his rifle trained on the entrance. The rhythmic banging from the other side grew more intense with each passing second, but the heavy metal door held firm against whatever was trying to break through. Parker flinched as he heard rapid footsteps approaching from behind, spinning around with his weapon raised before recognizing Foster and Melody running toward his position. He lowered his rifle and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "What the hell happened?" Foster demanded as he reached Parker's position. "Those things, they just came out of nowhere," Parker replied, his voice still shaking from what he'd witnessed. "Those people making a break for it never had a chance." Foster stared at the door, the relentless banging from the other side, creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to drill into his skull. The sound was interrupted by his radio crackling to life, breaking him out of his trance. "Hey, Cap, was that gunfire?" Sergeant Hanson's voice came through the static. Foster grabbed his radio from his vest and keyed the microphone. "Yeah, Sarge, there's trouble in the stairwell. Make sure you have them locked down," Foster replied. "I'm on it, Cap," Hanson responded. Before Foster could return the radio to his vest, the ear-splitting wail of the hotel's fire alarm system began blaring throughout the building. The piercing sound filled the hallway with such intensity that all three of them instinctively covered their ears, though it provided little relief from the assault on their hearing. "How do we shut that off?" Foster shouted over the alarm. "The front desk!" Melody yelled back, her voice barely audible over the noise. Foster looked toward the stairwell door, where the banging was still audible despite being nearly drowned out by the fire alarm. He considered their options for a moment before pulling out his handgun and firing a single round into the alarm speaker directly above them. The gunshot silenced their immediate area, though the sounds of distant alarms going off on multiple floors could still be heard echoing through the building. "That's a little better at least," Foster said, his ears still ringing from the noise. Foster pulled out his radio and clicked it back on. "Sergeant, what's the status on the 15th?" he asked. "I have Thomas on one door, and I'm on the other," Hanson replied through the static. "We have most of the VIPs ready to move, but I'm not sure how we're going to be able to move them." Foster paused for a moment before responding, pointing to Parker and motioning toward the opposite end of the hallway where another stairwell door was located. Parker nodded his understanding and took off running to cover the other entry point to their floor, his boots smacking on the carpet as he moved. "I'll finish getting people ready and try to keep them calm," Melody said, already moving toward the hotel room doors where confused civilians were beginning to emerge. "Cap, are you still there?" Hanson's voice crackled through the radio. "Yeah, sorry, Hanson, I was making sure we're covered," Foster replied. "No worries, Cap. So tell me, how are we getting out of this one?" the sergeant asked. "I'm still working on that, Sarge," he admitted, his mind racing through various escape scenarios. "We have enough firepower. We can just push our way down the stairwell," Hanson suggested. Foster considered the proposal for a moment before shaking his head, even though his sergeant couldn't see the gesture. And then what? Sullivan and Cooper aren't back with the bus yet. And with that fire alarm going off, there's going to be a lot of people walking into a situation that most of them aren't going to be walking away from, Foster replied. "Damn it, how far out is Sullivan with our ride?" Hanson asked. "Hang tight, let me see," Foster said, changing the frequency on his radio to reach the corporal. "Hey Sullivan, do you copy?" Foster spoke into the microphone. Foster held his breath while waiting for a response, exhaling only when his corporal's familiar voice crackled back through the static. "I'm here, Cap," Sullivan replied. "How far out are you?" Foster asked. "Maybe another 15 minutes. It's a little rough on the streets," Sullivan responded. "Yeah, it's a little rough in here too," Foster said, glancing toward the stairwell door where the banging continued. "Are you boys all right?" Sullivan asked, concern evident in his voice. "Yeah, we're fine, but we have about 70 people at the top of the casino and one hell of a welcoming committee below us," Foster explained. "How many are we talking about?" Sullivan pressed. "God only knows with the fire alarm going off," Foster replied. "I was wondering what that racket was," Sullivan said. "Yeah, it started going off a few minutes ago, which is complicating our escape in more ways than one," Foster continued. "Just tell me how we can help Cap," Sullivan offered. Foster began formulating a plan as he spoke, the pieces of their extraction strategy coming together in his mind. "The first thing is going to be shutting off the fire alarm. Melody said there's a way to do it at the front desk," he said. "Sounds easy enough, but then what?" Sullivan asked. "We're going to need a diversion in one of the stairwells. They're going to be packed with those things. And if we're going to be able to move 70 people, they're going to need to be clear," Foster explained. "Let me guess, Cooper and I are the bait," Sullivan said with resignation. Foster allowed himself a slight smile before responding. "It's that kind of situational awareness that got me to put in for your promotion." he replied. Sullivan let out a chuckle before responding. Yep, I'm a victim of my own success, he said. There are worse problems to have, Sullivan. Now, let me know when you're in position and we'll be ready to move, Foster instructed. Copy that, Cap, Sullivan replied, before clicking off the radio. Meanwhile, several miles away from the casino, Sullivan hooked the radio back onto his vest as he continued driving the commandeered city bus through the darkened streets of Las Vegas. Cooper sat in the front passenger seat, studying the bright lights of the Strip that continued to shine in the distance like a beacon in the darkness. It sounds like we're walking right into the shit, Sullivan, Cooper observed. Yeah, sounds like it, Cooper, Sullivan agreed, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he drove. The two soldiers made their way through the empty streets with caution, both hyper-aware of their surroundings after their encounter at the bus depot. Every shadow could hide another creature. Every alleyway could conceal a threat. The commandeered city bus handled differently than the military vehicles they were accustomed to. It was heavier, slower to respond, and created more noise than they would have preferred for a stealth approach. The two men remained silent as they continued driving toward the casino, each lost in their own thoughts about what they were about to face. The radio conversation with Foster had made it clear that their team was in serious trouble, and the success of the entire mission might depend on how well they executed this next phase. After several more minutes of driving, they reached the intersection that led directly to the Strip. Sullivan brought the bus to a stop, and both soldiers studied the scene before them. Their destination was visible a few blocks down on the other side of the street, but the route was far from clear. The streets were filled with movement, zombies running in various directions, drawn by sounds and lights throughout the entertainment district. The two soldiers focused their attention on the front of the Silver Moon Casino, which showed signs of activity around its open-air entrance. I'm not a fan of that, Sullivan, Cooper said, pointing toward the creatures visible near their target. Me either, Cooper. If we try and drive straight up to the casino, we're going to pull every one of those people to us, Sullivan replied. They sat in contemplation for a moment, studying the layout of the streets and buildings around their destination. Cooper broke the silence with a suggestion. Unless I'm mistaken, the casino runs the entire length of the block. We should be able to pull through and park beside the parking deck, he said. Sullivan looked back into the bus, as if searching for something that might help with their approach. Cooper, go to the back and see if there's an escape hatch in the roof, he instructed. Cooper did as he was told, making his way down the aisle toward the rear of the bus while scanning the ceiling above him. After a moment of searching, he called out excitedly from the back of the vehicle. Yeah, I got one here, but how does that help us? Cooper asked. Because we can park at the side of the deck and go out that way, he explained. The bus should be tall enough for us to reach the second floor. Cooper began nodding as he understood the corporal's thought process, his excitement building as the plan took shape. And we can load in the VIPs through it as well. With any luck, we'll be able to get in and out with those things on the street not catching on, Cooper added. I'll let the cap know once we're in position, Sullivan said, putting the bus back in drive. Cooper nodded and took a position beside the driver's seat as Sullivan hit the gas and pulled straight across the intersection. Both soldiers kept a close watch on the zombies visible down the street, relieved when none of the creatures seemed to notice their movement. It took Sullivan several minutes to navigate around the block, driving carefully to avoid drawing attention while searching for the best approach to the parking deck. Finally, he spotted the alleyway that ran alongside the casino's parking structure. He turned into the narrow space and cut the headlights, using the ambient light from the casino's exterior to navigate in the darkness. The alley was tight, but the bus fit with room to spare. After positioning the vehicle alongside the parking deck, Sullivan killed the engine but left the keys in the ignition in case they needed to make a quick escape. Come on, let's get topside and see if this is actually going to work, Sullivan said. The two soldiers moved to the rear of the bus, using the backs of the passenger seats as steps to reach the emergency escape hatch in the roof. They carefully removed the cover, and Sullivan stuck his head up through the opening to assess their position. He couldn't suppress a grin when he saw that the height of the bus brought them within reach of the second-floor barrier of the parking deck. The gap between the vehicle and the concrete structure was narrow enough that they could easily jump across. Sullivan looked back down at Cooper, grinning from ear to ear at his own brilliance. All right, Cooper, get your game face on because it's showtime. Chapter 6. Sullivan and Cooper climbed from the roof of the bus onto the second floor of the parking deck, their boots hitting the concrete pavement with soft thuds. Both soldiers landed at the same time and drew their handguns, sweeping the area in opposite directions to ensure they hadn't walked into an ambush. Making noise wasn't their first choice for a stealth insertion, but they'd rather have the ability to deal with a mob of creatures than be forced to jump back over the side in a hurry if they encountered resistance. Much to their relief, the parking level appeared clear, showing only rows of abandoned vehicles scattered throughout the concrete structure. Sullivan holstered his handgun and drew his combat knife, holding it in a reverse grip that would allow for quick, silent strikes. Cooper followed suit, understanding that stealth would be their best chance of reaching their objective without drawing every zombie in the casino to their position. "The first thing we need to do is shut off the fire alarm," Sullivan said quietly. "The good news is that the noise will give us some cover as we move, but use your blade if you can." "You got it, Sullivan. Lead the way," Cooper replied, checking the edge on his knife. The corporal nodded and stayed low as he led them across the second level of the parking deck toward the elevated walkway that connected the structure to the casino proper. The walkway was enclosed with glass panels and appeared to lead directly into the second floor of the gaming complex. They stopped at the edge of the walkway entrance, pressing themselves against the concrete wall as they peered around the corner. Through the glass panels, they could see a couple of creatures wandering aimlessly on the casino side, their movements erratic as they searched for prey. Sullivan kept them in hiding for several tense moments, hoping the zombies would wander off and clear their path. The fire alarm's constant wailing seemed to confuse the creatures, making it difficult for them to focus on any particular sound or movement. He didn't have to wait long. The zombies suddenly perked up, as if they'd detected something, then took off running deeper into the casino in pursuit of some unseen target. Sullivan gave Cooper a nod, and the two soldiers moved swiftly across the walkway, their footsteps muffled by the glass-enclosed passage. They were nearly to the casino entrance when a zombie staggered out from behind a support column on the left side of the walkway. The creature appeared to be a former casino patron, still wearing the remnants of what had once been an expensive suit. Blood stained the fabric, and several bite marks were visible on its neck and arms. Sullivan didn't hesitate. He picked up his pace and lowered his shoulder, plowing into the side of the ghoul before it had a chance to react. The fire alarm's deafening noise had masked the soldier's approach perfectly, giving him the element of surprise. The impact sent the zombie crashing to the ground, its arms flailing as it tried to regain its balance. Before the creature could get back to its feet, Sullivan dropped down and drove his knife into the side of its head with surgical precision. The zombie went limp, never having seen its killer coming. The two soldiers paused to scan their surroundings, ensuring the brief scuffle hadn't attracted any unwanted attention. The second floor of the casino stretched out before them, filled with closed shops, restaurants, and several seating areas that had been abandoned when the apocalypse began. A handful of zombies were visible in the distance, clustered around a storefront window as they tried to get at something inside. The creatures were completely focused on their target and remained oblivious to the soldiers' presence. Sullivan got back to his feet and motioned for Cooper to follow. The two men moved quickly across the open space, weaving between overturned chairs and scattered debris, until they found an escalator that descended to the main gaming floor. They stopped at the top of the escalator and looked out across what had once been an elegant casino floor. The scene below them was one of complete carnage. Zombies ran rampant everywhere, chasing after unfortunate civilians who had taken the fire alarms seriously and attempted to evacuate the building. Bodies littered the gaming floor between overturned slot machines and card tables. Some ghouls were still feeding on their victims, while others were beginning to wander away from the fallen as their prey showed the first signs of reanimation. The sight was disturbing enough, but what made it worse was watching fresh zombies rise from the carnage and begin hunting for new victims. The infection was spreading rapidly through the trapped population. "Sullivan, on the left," Cooper said quietly, pointing toward the far side of the gaming floor. Cooper had spotted the front desk area, which was positioned near the main entrance to the casino. The desk's design was open on top, which would allow them easy access to the controls they needed if they could reach it without being detected. At the base of their escalator, 3 zombies were milling around in apparent confusion. The creatures seemed to be searching for something to pursue, but nothing was catching their eye. Sullivan studied the situation for a moment, then got a slight smirk on his face as an idea formed. "Follow my lead and get ready to move when I do," he instructed. Sullivan began moving quickly down the escalator, which was currently running in the opposite direction and moving up toward the second floor. As he reached the halfway point, he used his handgun to strike the smooth metal handrail repeatedly, creating a sharp clanging sound that was loud enough to be heard through the alarm bells. The metallic impacts reached the creature's ears, causing all three zombies to let out excited moans as they abandoned their aimless wandering and charged up the escalator toward the source of the noise. When the zombies got within a few steps of his position, Sullivan jumped up onto the center divider of the escalator bank and slid down the metal surface, gliding right past the ascending creatures. Cooper was caught off guard for a moment by the audacity of Sullivan's maneuver. He was saved from the zombies' grasping hands only because they were focused on the corporal as he slid past them. The private quickly followed Sullivan's example, jumping onto the divider and sliding down toward the gaming floor. A couple of the creatures managed to swipe at Cooper as he went by, their fingernails scraping against his uniform, but they weren't able to get a solid grip on him as he slid past. As the two soldiers reached the bottom of the escalator, they glanced back at the trio of zombies, who attempted to pursue them down the moving stairs. The creatures fell when they couldn't navigate the mechanical steps, face-planting onto the metal surface as the escalator continued to carry them upward, making it nearly impossible for them to regain their footing. "Come on, let's get to the desk," Sullivan said. The two soldiers sprinted across the gaming floor, dodging between abandoned slot machines and overturned gaming tables as they made their way toward the front desk area. They vaulted over the marble counter and concealed themselves behind the solid wall that separated the desk area from the main casino floor. Cooper poked his head up cautiously, scanning the immediate area to confirm that their sprint across the open floor hadn't drawn any unwanted attention from the zombies scattered throughout the casino. "We're good, Sullivan," Cooper reported quietly. Sullivan nodded and pulled out his radio, adjusting the volume to a lower setting before keying the microphone. "Hey Cap, are you there?" He spoke quietly into the device. "What's the situation, Sullivan?" Foster's voice crackled back through the static. "We're at the front desk. Cooper is working on turning off the fire alarm," Sullivan reported. He looked over to see Cooper studying the computer terminal behind the desk, following the on-screen emergency procedures to disable the building's fire alarm system. After a tense moment of waiting, the deafening fire alarm finally fell silent. "That's a lot better." Foster's voice came through the radio with relief. Sullivan sat quietly for a moment, but now that the fire alarm was no longer masking other sounds, he could hear the disturbing chorus of moaning and shuffling coming from the gaming floor around them. He kept his voice low while turning down the radio's volume even further. "Not from my perspective, Cap," Sullivan replied grimly. "You have trouble?" Foster asked. "And lots of it. Hang on," Sullivan said, cutting the transmission temporarily. Sullivan raised his head carefully above the level of the front desk, looking for their next objective. The nearest stairwell was approximately 30 yards away across open floor space, with several zombies scattered between their current position and their target. The stairwell entrance appeared to be open rather than secured by a door. Sullivan ducked back down and keyed his radio again. "Okay, Cap, I think we can reach the north stairwell," he reported. "I'll get the people moved into position," Foster replied. "How much time do you need?" Sullivan asked. "Move when you're ready. It's going to take time for those things to clear out of the stairwell," Foster said. "Copy that, Cap." We parked the bus beside the parking deck, and it's a short drop from the second floor. The emergency roof hatch is open, so you should be able to get people in through there, Sullivan explained. "Good thinking, Sullivan. Now the big question, what are you and Cooper going to do?" Foster asked. Sullivan looked over to Cooper, who had finished with the fire alarm system and was now examining a bank of security monitors built into the front desk area. The private was studying the various camera feeds and appeared to have found something interesting. Cooper motioned for Sullivan to join him at the monitors, pointing to one screen that showed a clear view of the casino's sportsbook area. "Hang on, Cap. Cooper might have an idea," Sullivan said into the radio before moving over to see what the private had discovered. Cooper pointed to the monitor showing the sportsbook section, which featured a waist-high wall surrounding part of the area, along with what appeared to be a private bar setup. "What the hell is that?" Sullivan asked, studying the layout on the security feed. "I think it's the VIP section of the sportsbook. It's not the most cover in the world, but it's better than nothing, Cooper explained. What the hell? I've been wondering about the score to the game anyway, Sullivan said with a chuckle. He clicked the radio back on to update Foster on their plan. Okay, Cap, we're going to be in the sports book. There's a VIP area with some cover, Sullivan reported. Copy that, Sullivan. I'll let you know when we have everyone loaded on, and we'll figure out how to get the two of you out, Foster replied. Gotcha, Cap. We're going to be lighting the fuse on the stairwell momentarily, Sullivan said. Be safe, and we'll see you on the bus, Foster responded. Sullivan cut the radio connection and clipped the device back to his vest before checking his handgun and returning his knife to its sheath. The next phase of their operation would require more firepower than stealth. So, how are we going to pull those things out of the stairwell? Cooper asked. Sullivan reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a fragmentation grenade, holding it up for Cooper to see. The private could only shake his head at the straightforward brutality of the plan. Well, that's certainly one way to do it, Cooper observed. Come on, Cooper, let's get this done. Chapter 7. Sullivan and Cooper made their way through the back office area behind the front desk. The office space was cramped and filled with the usual items: employee schedules, incident reports, and stacks of forms that would never be processed. They reached the exit door that led back onto the main casino floor, and Sullivan pulled it open just a crack, peering through the narrow gap to assess the situation beyond. The scene that greeted him was exactly what he'd expected, but hoped to avoid. 4 zombies stood directly in their path to the stairwell entrance, their heads turning back and forth as they searched for prey. Through the open stairwell doorway, Sullivan could see additional movement, dark shapes shifting in the concrete space that suggested more creatures were awaiting them. We're going to rush these 4 and put them down fast, Sullivan whispered to Cooper. Once I toss this into the stairwell, we're hauling ass to the sports book. Cooper nodded and switched from his sidearm and knife to his assault rifle, checking the magazine to ensure he had a full load of ammunition. I'm pretty sure stealth is out the window as soon as that goes off, Cooper observed, gesturing toward the grenade clipped to Sullivan's vest. Sullivan acknowledged the truth of that statement with a grim nod before positioning himself at the door. He took a deep breath, mentally preparing for the violent sprint that would follow, then threw the door wide open and darted into the casino, with Cooper following close behind. The 2 soldiers ran hard toward the stairwell, their boots pounding against the carpeted floor as they covered the distance between the office and their target. Sullivan spotted a bank of upholstered chairs, positioned just to the right of the stairwell entrance, providing the cover they would need for their assault. The duo stopped behind the seating area and took aim at the 4 zombies blocking their path. Sullivan fired first, his single shot catching one creature center mass and spinning it around, though not dropping it. Cooper followed up with controlled 3-round bursts, his superior marksmanship putting the remaining zombies down with efficient precision. "Throw that thing and let's move," Cooper urged. Sullivan ran around the chairs and pulled the pin from his fragmentation grenade, letting the safety lever fly as he approached the stairwell entrance. He stopped approximately 15 yards from the doorway when he spotted several zombies emerging from the concrete space, drawn by the sound of gunfire. The corporal threw the grenade as hard as he could, aiming for the feet of the emerging creatures. The device hit the ground and bounced once before rolling directly through the group of zombies as they continued their charge toward the soldiers. Sullivan raised his handgun to engage the approaching threats, but Cooper was faster on the draw. His rifle rounds tore into the ghouls as they tried to close the distance, most of the impacts striking center mass rather than the headshots that would have dropped them instantly. The bullets were enough to slow their advance and stagger them, giving Sullivan time to retreat to a safer distance. The corporal had barely made it back to Cooper's position when the grenade detonated with a thunderous blast that echoed throughout the casino. The explosion's force knocked down several zombies that had been near the entrance, while completely obliterating the creatures that had been descending toward the source of the gunfire. "Come on, we gotta move!" Sullivan shouted over the ringing in their ears. Sullivan shouldered his rifle while Cooper slapped a fresh magazine into his weapon, the practice motion taking only seconds. The 2 soldiers took off running deeper into the casino, weaving between slot machines and gaming tables as they moved toward their defensive position. As they ran, they could see zombies converging on the area from multiple directions, all drawn by the explosion and the sounds of combat. Rather than engage with the growing crowd of creatures, Cooper led them toward a dense bank of slot machines. They took cover just before the first wave of zombies could spot them, pressing themselves against the side of the gaming machines as the creatures rushed past their position. The soldiers remained motionless as ghouls ran toward the site of the explosion, only to collide with other creatures that were simultaneously running out of the damaged stairwell. The collision created a confused mass of zombies that were unsure which direction to pursue, buying Sullivan and Cooper precious time to continue their movement. Sullivan took point and led them out from their hiding spot, staying as concealed as possible between the numerous banks of slot machines that filled this section of the casino floor. The maze of gaming equipment provided excellent cover, but it also limited their visibility and created multiple blind corners where creatures could be lurking. As they moved deeper into the casino, a zombie suddenly emerged from between two rows of machines, apparently having become separated from the main group as it tried to follow the sounds of combat. The creature appeared disoriented by the maze of equipment, but it would only be a matter of seconds before it spotted the soldiers. Sullivan reacted without hesitation, darting forward and grabbing the ghoul by the front of its torn shirt before it could lock onto their position. He used the creature's momentum against it, shifting his weight and pulling downward with all his strength to drive the zombie's face into the carpeted floor with bone-jarring force. Before the creature could recover from the impact, Cooper stepped up and brought the butt of his rifle down hard against the back of its skull. The first strike caused the zombie's skull to crack audibly, but the second blow was enough to completely shatter the bone and destroy the brain tissue beneath. The creature convulsed briefly on the ground before going still. The two soldiers continued their tactical withdrawal through the casino, managing to cover approximately 50 yards without being detected by the numerous creatures that were still running in multiple directions throughout the gaming floor. The chaos caused by the grenade blast was working in their favor, creating enough confusion to mask their movement. Finally, they reached a position where the sportsbook area came into view across a large open space that had once served as a gathering area for casino patrons. The VIP section was clearly visible, marked by its distinctive waist-high barrier and private bar setup. However, their path was not clear. Several zombies were kneeling over what appeared to be a recent victim, methodically tearing chunks of flesh from the poor man's torso as he bled out on the carpet. The feeding ghouls were focused on their meal and hadn't noticed the soldiers' approach. The two soldiers exchanged a quick look, each understanding what needed to be done. "Put them down and get behind the bar," Sullivan said quietly. Cooper nodded and followed the corporal as they emerged from cover, moving across the open area in a tactical formation with their rifles held at the ready. As soon as one of the feeding creatures lifted its head at the sound of their approach, Sullivan fired a single, precise round that struck the ghoul in the side of the head. The gunshot got the attention of the remaining creatures, who looked up from their feeding with blood-stained faces. This made them easy targets, and several well-placed shots later, they were lying motionless on top of their victim. Rather than immediately sprint to cover, Cooper paused beside the fallen man, looking down at him as he struggled through his final moments. The victim was still breathing, though barely, and he attempted to speak. Only gurgled blood emerged from his mouth instead of words. "Cooper, move your ass!" Sullivan shouted from near the VIP barrier. Cooper snapped out of his momentary hesitation, raising his rifle and providing the dying man with a quick, merciful end before running to catch up with the corporal. The two soldiers ran hard across the remaining distance, vaulting over the waist-high barrier that surrounded the sportsbook's VIP area. They didn't slow their pace once they cleared the barrier, continuing to pump their legs as they sprinted toward the bar. Both men leaped over the polished wooden counter and slid across its surface, landing on the other side in a crouch. They began sweeping the area behind the bar to ensure it was clear of threats, their weapons trained on every shadow and corner until they were satisfied they were alone. Only then did they allow themselves to duck down behind the solid cover the bar provided. "What the hell was that back there?" Sullivan asked. "It just felt wrong to let him suffer needlessly," Cooper replied quietly. Sullivan considered the younger soldier's response for a moment, understanding the moral complexity of their situation. He nodded and gave the young soldier a reassuring pat on the back, acknowledging that some things were worth the risk. Sullivan pulled out his radio, as the sound of moaning began to grow louder from just beyond the VIP area. He carefully raised his head above the bar's surface and spotted half a dozen zombies pressed against the barrier wall, apparently drawn by the gunfire, but making no effort to climb over the obstacle. "Cap, do you copy?" Sullivan spoke into the radio. "That was one hell of a diversion, Sullivan," Foster replied. "Well, I figured if we were given grenades, we should use them. Would feel rude not to," Sullivan replied. Foster's laughter came through the radio static, a welcome sound given their circumstances. "Can't argue with that. Are you boys safe?" Foster asked. "Safe-ish. We're in the bar in the sportsbook VIP area, but we pulled a lot of attention our way," Sullivan reported. "Well, just hang tight and have a cold one for me. I'll let you know when we are loaded up," Foster said. "Copy that, Cap," Sullivan acknowledged. "I'll be in touch," Foster replied, before cutting the transmission. Meanwhile, 14 floors above the casino, Foster clicked off his radio and looked back at the dozens of conference attendees who were lined up behind him in the hallway, their faces showing various degrees of fear and confusion about what was happening. He switched his radio to a different frequency to contact his sergeant. "Hey, Sarge, are you about ready to move?" Foster asked. "Just about, Captain." 2 minutes, Hansen's voice replied through the static. Foster didn't respond as he saw Melody approaching with a middle-aged woman walking beside her. The woman had the bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge, and her expression suggested she had something important to discuss. "Captain, this woman needs to talk to you," Melody said as they reached his position. Foster glanced at his watch, acutely aware that time was working against them. "Can it wait?" he asked. "It really can't," Melody replied with unusual seriousness. Foster turned around and forced himself to put on a professional smile as he addressed the woman. "Captain, my name is Jennifer Wilson, and I was in charge of organizing the conference," the woman said, extending her hand. "Okay, Jennifer, so what's the problem?" Foster asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer wouldn't be good news. "Well, Melody here said that you were rounding us up because of some threat. She handed me the list of names for me to look over. And I'm sorry to say that only about half of them made it to check in," Jennifer explained. Foster felt his stomach sink as he realized the implications of her statement. "Let me guess, they were sick?" he asked. "That's right. A few of them who showed up were sick, but I don't see any of them here," Jennifer confirmed. "It's okay, Jennifer. We're going to take who we can," Foster said, deliberately remaining vague to avoid causing additional panic among the civilians. "Okay, but these 4 names you have at the top here, the keynote speakers," Jennifer continued, pointing to the priority targets on Foster's list. Foster's concern spiked at the mention of the VIPs that DC had specifically identified as critical to the mission. "What about them?" he asked. "Well, they're not here," Jennifer said simply. "None of the 4 showed up?" Foster pressed. "Oh no, they showed up, but they're not here," Jennifer clarified, holding up the list and pointing to one particular name. "This man, David Miller, he's a local. Every year he takes the keynote speakers to his house for a private late dinner." "Damn it, do you know if they're still there?" he asked. "I would imagine so. Usually they drink so much they pass out there. At least that's the way it's been in years past," Jennifer explained. "So where does he live?" Foster asked. "I wish I could tell you, Captain, but I don't know," Jennifer said apologetically. Foster let out a frustrated sigh before forcing himself to refocus on their escape. "Okay, one problem at a time," he said, more to himself than to Jennifer. Foster nodded to the conference organizer in appreciation before stepping to the side and letting out a loud whistle to get everyone's attention. "Okay, everyone, listen up. You all know what's going on, and we're about to run headlong into it," Foster announced to the group. He paused to ensure he had their full attention before continuing. "We're moving to the 2nd floor, going over to the parking deck and dropping down to the bus waiting for us. We move as one, and we move fast. Now get ready, because we're heading out." Chapter 8. Captain Foster threw open the stairwell door and rushed through the opening with his rifle held at the ready, his finger hovering near the trigger as he swept the concrete landing for zombies. The sound of his boots echoed in the enclosed space as he quickly checked the landing below his position, ensuring their path was clear. Behind him, he heard the metallic clang of another stairwell door opening on the floor above. Sergeant Hansen's familiar footsteps descended toward Foster's position. the sound of his tactical gear creating a rhythmic percussion against the concrete walls. Foster maintained his defensive position as Hansen reached his level, and the two soldiers took up positions shoulder to shoulder, both aiming down into the depths of the stairwell to watch for any movement from below. "Let's get these people down, Hansen. Second floor, let's move," Foster instructed. "You got it, Cap," Hansen replied, turning back toward the hallway where the conference attendees waited anxiously. Hansen looked through the open door and motioned for the civilians to follow them down the stairs. The group began moving with varying degrees of confidence, some striding purposefully, while others hesitated at each step, clearly terrified of what might be waiting for them in the stairwell. Foster and Hansen maintained their tactical formation, staying a full flight of stairs ahead of the civilian group to provide early warning of any threats. Their boots created a steady rhythm on the concrete steps as they descended, weapons trained on the darkness below. The group made steady progress down through the upper floors, the civilians doing their best to remain quiet despite their fear and the awkwardness of navigating the stairs in near darkness. The only sounds were the soft shuffling of footsteps and the occasional whispered reassurance between the conference attendees. As they reached the 10th floor landing, everything changed in an instant. The stairwell door flew open with violent force, catching Sergeant Hansen by surprise. He braced himself as the heavy metal door slammed into his shoulder, ducking down at the last second to avoid taking the full impact in his face. A zombie burst through the opening like a missile, its body propelled by the momentum of its charge toward the noise that had drawn its attention. The creature's eyes were vacant, but its movements were filled with predatory hunger as it launched itself toward the soldiers. Foster reacted with the reflexes of a combat veteran, grabbing the zombie by its back shoulder and using its own momentum against it. With a sharp twist of his torso, he flung the creature down the stairwell, sending it tumbling through the air. The ghoul landed hard on the concrete landing below, with a sickening crack that suggested multiple bones had broken on impact. Despite the damage from the fall, the creature began attempting to scramble back to its feet, its limbs moving in ways that indicated serious injury, but not death. Foster didn't hesitate. He descended the stairs in several quick bounds and leaped from the steps, landing hard on the zombie's back and pinning it against the concrete. As the creature thrashed beneath him, he drew his combat knife and drove it into the base of its skull with surgical precision, severing the spinal cord and ending the threat permanently. The soldiers kept the civilian group moving, everyone doing their best to remain as quiet as possible despite the adrenaline coursing through their systems. Foster and Hansen resumed their positions ahead of the group, constantly scanning for any other creatures that wanted to challenge them. Before long, they reached the second floor landing, where their extraction point waited. Foster and Hansen took up tactical positions, with the sergeant positioning himself beside the door, while Foster prepared to lead the way onto the floor. Foster gave Hansen the signal, and the sergeant pulled the door open in one smooth motion. Foster darted through the opening, his rifle sweeping left and right as he looked for something to shoot. Two zombies stood within 5 yards of the stairwell entrance, both of them turning toward the sound of the opening door with predatory interest. Foster didn't hesitate. He rushed toward the first creature and grabbed it by the arm, yanking it backward into Hansen's waiting hands. The sergeant drove his knife into the zombie's face without ceremony, the blade punching through the eye socket and destroying the brain tissue beyond. The creature went limp in his grip, and he let the body drop to the floor. Meanwhile, Foster turned to face the second zombie that was bearing down on his position, with arms outstretched and mouth open in a snarl. He stepped to the side at the last moment, driving his knife into the creature's chest and using the embedded blade as a handle to pull the ghoul off balance. The zombie tumbled backward to the ground, and Foster maintained his grip on the knife handle as he pulled the weapon free. In one fluid motion, he drove the blade straight down into the creature's face, the tip piercing the eye and penetrating deep into the brain cavity. The zombie's limbs stopped moving within seconds. The two soldiers quickly holstered their knives and raised their rifles as they spotted a couple dozen zombies scattered across the second floor of the casino. The creatures were spread throughout the gaming area, some wandering aimlessly while others appeared to be feeding on recent victims. From the first floor below, they could hear a massive chorus of moans and shuffling footsteps that suggested an even larger concentration of creatures. Fortunately, the noise from below seemed to be holding the attention of the zombies on their current level. Before they could begin moving their group toward the parking deck walkway, gunshots suddenly erupted from the floors above them. The rapid succession of shots echoed down through the stairwell, creating a new source of noise that drew the attention of every zombie within hearing distance. Foster and Hansen exchanged confused looks, both wondering who was engaging targets above them. They didn't have long to ponder the question, as the sound of gunfire caused the zombies on their floor to turn and begin moving in their direction. "Light them up!" Foster commanded. Foster and Hansen raised their rifles simultaneously and opened fire on the approaching horde. Their initial shots were well placed, dropping the closest zombies with clean headshots, but the larger group continued to advance across the casino floor. The two soldiers began a fighting withdrawal toward the entrance to the parking deck walkway, with Hansen sweeping the enclosed passage to ensure it was clear, while Foster laid down covering fire across the second floor. Zombies dropped one by one as both soldiers found their rhythm, the corpses beginning to pile up in front of the advancing horde. Hansen joined the engagement once he'd confirmed the walkway was secure, and their combined firepower began to thin the ranks of approaching creatures significantly. Private Parker took point position and began leading the group of terrified civilians through the walkway toward the waiting bus. The enclosed passage provided some protection from the chaos erupting behind them, but the sound of sustained gunfire was doing nothing to calm the conference attendees' nerves. As they moved through the walkway, they saw an SUV speeding past on the parking deck across from them, with several zombies trailing behind it in pursuit. The vehicle disappeared around a corner, vanishing from view as quickly as it had appeared. While most of the ghouls continued following the SUV, a few of them spotted the crowd of people moving through the elevated walkway and began converging on their position. "Damn it!" Parker cursed as he realized their group had been spotted. Parker fumbled with his weapon for a moment, his hands shaking from adrenaline, as he tried to bring his rifle to bear on the approaching threats. His first few shots went wide of their targets, missing the zombies entirely and allowing the four creatures to close to within 20 yards of the civilian group. The private forced himself to take a breath and steady his aim before firing again. His next shot found its mark, dropping one creature with a clean headshot. But his methodical aiming was taking too long given the speed of the approaching zombies. Within moments, the remaining 3 zombies reached the front edge of the civilian group. People began trying to retreat, but they were pushed forward by the throng of panicked conference attendees behind them, who were reacting to the gunfire coming from the casino. "Watch out!" Parker shouted. Parker attempted to adjust his aim and engaged the 3 remaining creatures as they slammed into the front ranks of survivors, but he couldn't get clear shots without risking hitting the civilians who were now locked in close combat with the zombies. He watched helplessly as 2 of the creatures managed to bite into people, their teeth tearing flesh from bone as their victims screamed in pain and terror. The 3rd zombie was being wrestled to the ground by a couple of larger men who had managed to grab it before it could attack anyone else. Parker rushed over to assist with the pinned zombie, pressing the muzzle of his rifle against the back of its head and pulling the trigger. The creature's skull exploded in a spray of brain matter and blood, causing the men who had been restraining it to recoil in horror and disgust. "Help us!" a woman screamed from nearby. Parker looked up to see that the other 2 zombies were barely being held at bay by several civilians, the creatures continuing to chew on the flesh they had torn from their victims' arms. The bitten survivors were still standing but clearly in shock from their injuries. The private rushed over and repeated his execution technique, placing his rifle against each zombie's head and firing point-blank shots that ended their attacks instantly. Within seconds, the immediate threat at the front of the group had been neutralized, though the intense gunfire from the casino continued to echo behind them. Parker gave the injured victims a quick assessment, noting that both had suffered bite wounds on their arms. The injuries were serious but not immediately life-threatening, and the victims were still mobile. Rather than cause additional panic by dealing with the infected individuals with lethal force, Parker decided they could handle it on the bus. "Everybody to the bus! Let's move!" Parker shouted to the group. The private got the civilian group moving again, leading them out of the walkway and onto the parking deck level. To his relief, the concrete structure appeared to be clear of zombies. He led them to the side of the parking deck, where they could see the commandeered city bus positioned directly below them. The drop from the parking structure to the bus roof was only a few feet, making it a manageable descent for most of the group. "Everybody over the side right now, let's move," Parker ordered, Parker began assisting people over the ledge, helping them drop down to the bus roof below, where other survivors were already helping newcomers get through the emergency hatch and into the vehicle's interior. After several minutes of steady progress, Private Thomas appeared from the rear of the civilian group to assist with the evacuation. Having 2 soldiers managing the process significantly improved their efficiency, and most of the able-bodied conference attendees were able to navigate the drop without assistance. Those who needed help were quickly aided by the survivors who had already made it onto the bus, creating an efficient human chain that moved people from the parking deck into the relative safety of the vehicle below. The group managed to get approximately half of the people safely down to the bus roof when the gunfire from behind them suddenly intensified to a level that suggested their teammates were in serious trouble. Parker looked back toward the walkway and saw Foster and Hansen running in their direction, firing wildly behind them as they retreated from some unseen threat. The desperation in their movements made it clear that they were being overwhelmed. "Get over the side! Get over the side!" Foster shouted as he approached their position. Parker's eyes went wide when he saw the massive horde of zombies pouring out of the walkway in pursuit of the other 2 soldiers. The creatures moved like a wave of death, their numbers far exceeding anything they had encountered so far. "Everybody go now!" Parker screamed at the remaining civilians. Parker ran down the line of waiting people, physically pushing those who were hesitating, while continuing to shout orders. The scene became chaotic as bodies flew over the ledge in rapid succession. Some nearly knocked off the bus roof by others landing on top of them. Once the last civilian was over the side, Parker turned and raised his rifle toward the approaching horde, firing several shots in an attempt to slow their advance and buy his teammates precious seconds. Most of his shots were ineffective given the distance and the dim lighting, though one round caught a zombie near the middle of the pack in the head, dropping it and causing others to stumble over the body. Foster and Hansen reached the ledge at full sprint, launching themselves over the barrier without hesitation or time to look where they were landing. They flew through the air and crashed onto the bus roof, where several of the larger male survivors caught them and helped break their fall. Parker was the last man over the side, leaping from the parking deck just as the front edge of the zombie horde reached their position. He landed solidly on the bus roof and immediately spun around to face the parking deck, his rifle trained on the concrete barrier above them. He held his defensive position as dozens of zombies slammed against the barrier, their hands clawing at the concrete as they tried to reach the survivors below. To Parker's relief, none of the creatures attempted to climb over the obstacle, apparently lacking the cognitive ability to solve that particular problem. The private maintained his vigilant stance until Captain Foster stepped over and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I think we're all right, Parker," Foster said quietly. Parker let out a long sigh of relief and lowered his weapon to his side, finally allowing himself to relax after the intensity of their escape. "I'm sorry, Captain. I tried to get everyone here safely," Parker said, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility for the civilians under his protection. Foster looked around the bus roof, taking note of all the survivors who had made it to their extraction point. "I didn't have to step over anybody from our group to get here. You did a damn fine job," Foster replied with conviction. "2 people, though, they got bitten on the arm," Parker admitted. Foster paused for a moment before giving the young soldier another reassuring pat on the back. "They're still alive, so I'm counting that as a win," Foster said. Both soldiers looked back up at the horde of ghouls that continued to grow at the edge of the parking deck, their moans creating a disturbing soundtrack to the survivors' temporary safety. "Come on, let's get inside. We still have to figure out how we're getting Sullivan and Cooper." Chapter 9. Foster dropped down through the emergency hatch into the bus, the last man off the roof. The interior was cramped and filled with frightened civilians who were getting settled into their seats, many of them looking worriedly out of the windows as a handful of zombies found their way to the bus from the strip ahead. Foster gently pushed his way through the narrow aisle to the front of the bus, where the rest of his men were standing and looking out the large windshield toward the chaotic scene on the strip beyond. The view was disturbing. Abandoned vehicles scattered across the road, zombies moving between them, and the occasional survivor attempting to flee on foot. Sitting in the driver's seat was Melody, who had taken charge of the vehicle with the confidence of someone who belonged with the group. Her transformation from hotel desk clerk to essential team member had been remarkable, and Foster found himself grateful for her quick thinking and adaptability. "Hanson, status report," Foster said. "We got everyone on board, and we have someone looking at the injured," Hanson replied, glancing toward the back of the bus where one of the conference attendees was tending to the bite victims. "All we had was a small med kit that was under the driver's seat, but it should get the job done, at least until we get to the stadium," Thomas reported. Foster paused, knowing his next words would not be well received by his team. "We're not going to the stadium, at least not yet," he said. Melody turned in the driver's seat to stare at him with confusion. "What do you mean we're not going to the stadium?" she asked. "You are, but we aren't," Foster replied, pointing to the 3 other soldiers standing at the front of the bus. Melody gave the captain a strange look that matched Sergeant Hanson's expression of growing concern. "What in the hell are you talking about?" Melody demanded. "Yeah, what she said," Hanson added, with a quick gesture towards the clerk. Foster took a breath before explaining the complication that would extend their mission. "The keynote speakers aren't here. They're off at one of their houses," he said. Hanson's reaction was immediate and predictable. "Well, it sucks to be them. Look out there, Cap. Does it look like we have time to run another errand?" the sergeant said, pointing out the front of the bus. The view through the windshield reinforced his point. Zombies were continuing to grow in number on the strip, and as they watched, a car drove by at high speed. The vehicle was swarmed by creatures within seconds, and they could hear tires skidding before it slammed into something with a crash that echoed through the alley. "Hell, I'm not sure we're getting out of here in one piece," Hanson continued. Before Foster could respond to his sergeant's concerns, they heard the sound of a car horn coming from behind them. The soldiers looked in the side mirrors and watched as a vehicle with multiple zombies clinging to its front end made the turn into the alleyway where they were parked. The car picked up speed as it approached the bus, apparently trying to escape the creatures attached to it. The driver slammed into the rear of their vehicle with enough force to send the bus lurching forward slightly, though not enough to cause any serious damage. "Foster," Hanson said, trailing off as he spoke the captain's name. The single word conveyed everything he was feeling about their deteriorating situation. "Sergeant, your objection is noted, but the general said these 4 men were a priority, and that order came straight from D.C. Besides, we have to go back in and get Sullivan and Cooper, and it wouldn't be polite to hold all these people up," Foster explained. Hanson let out a frustrated sigh as he looked over to Melody, who gave him a slight nod that suggested she agreed with Foster's reasoning. "Yeah, fine, but how in the hell are we supposed to get to them?" Hanson asked. "Or find out where they live," Parker added, raising another practical concern. Melody reached into her pocket and pulled out a set of keys, tossing them over to Foster with a slight smile. "I can't help you with the second part, but I can help with the first," she said. "There's a pink SUV on the top floor of the parking deck. It might be a tight fit, but you should be able to squeeze everybody in there." Foster caught the keys and nodded his appreciation. "Thank you, Melody. Now, can you drive the bus?" he asked. "As long as I'm not responsible for any cosmetic damage, I think I can manage," she replied, with the kind of humor that had helped her survive the night. Another car crashed somewhere ahead of them, the sound of breaking glass and crumpling metal adding to the symphony of destruction that was consuming Las Vegas. Foster looked down at his watch and noted that the time was just after 4:30 in the morning. "It's going to be light in a couple of hours, which is going to make life a lot more difficult," Foster observed. "Do you know how to get to the college football stadium on the south side of town?" "Yeah, I've lived here all my life, so I can get there," Melody confirmed. "Good. I want you to stay put until you get my signal. We need to get back into the casino, and I think our only option is the front door," Foster said. Hanson's reaction was immediate and incredulous. "Are you crazy, Foster?" he asked. Foster considered the question seriously before answering. "A little bit, Sarge. I know we can go through the parking deck, but it's going to be just as big of a risk, and I want to check out the strip to see if it's passable for the bus," he explained. Hanson thought about the captain's words for a moment, weighing the tactical considerations before nodding his grudging agreement. "Yeah, fine. That makes sense," he conceded. Foster turned to one of his remaining soldiers. "Parker, I need your radio," he said. The private complied without question, pulling the radio from his tactical vest and handing it over. Foster changed the frequency before passing the device to Melody. "When you get close to the stadium, hit the call button and let them know you're coming. They'll let you know where to go," Foster instructed. Melody took the radio and clipped it to her belt, then stood up from the driver's seat. "Thank you, Captain, for everything," she said, moving forward to give him an unexpected hug. Foster remained motionless for a moment, unsure how to respond while his men watched with barely concealed amusement. After a few seconds, Melody released him and returned to her position behind the wheel. "I'll wait on your signal before I go," she said. Foster nodded and turned around to address the civilians in the back of the bus. The conference attendees looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear, waiting for reassurance about their uncertain future. "I know you all are scared, but you're almost to safety," Foster announced. "Melody is going to get you to the stadium in one piece. Just hang in there a little longer." Foster turned back to Melody and gave her a final nod of confirmation. "Open the door, and as soon as we're out, close it up and lock it," he instructed. Melody nodded and reached for the door control switch. The mechanism hissed as the bus door folded open, and Foster rushed out with his rifle raised, immediately moving around the front end of the vehicle where several creatures were pawing at the metal exterior. In swift, brutal fashion, he fired 3 quick shots from just a few feet away. The bullets struck the zombies in their heads, jerking their bodies hard to the side from the impact before they dropped to the asphalt. The gunshots alerted additional zombies who were swarming around the wrecked car at the rear of the bus. The ghouls barely managed to clear the side of the bus before Hanson, Parker, and Thomas put them down with ease. Foster motioned for the others to follow him, and the 4 soldiers moved forward in tactical formation, with their weapons pointed toward the strip ahead. As they approached the main thoroughfare, another vehicle sped past their position, its driver slamming on the brakes as zombies threw themselves at the moving car. The sound of bodies hitting metal filled the air as the vehicle managed to come to a stop. The driver threw it into reverse and began backing away quickly, but half a dozen zombies followed the car as it tried to escape. The vehicle only managed to clear the intersection before another car slammed into it with tremendous force. Foster stopped at the edge of the casino building and looked in both directions along the strip, his heart sinking at what he saw. Cars were piled up in multiple wrecks stretching in both directions, with zombies roaming freely in the spaces between the abandoned vehicles. He thought the bus might be able to navigate around the obstacles to the right, but a fallen streetlight was covering a significant portion of the roadway. "Damn it," Foster muttered under his breath. He didn't have time to dwell, however, knowing they needed to reach cover before the growing zombie population spotted them. He motioned for his team to follow as they made the turn onto the sidewalk that ran along the strip. Most of the zombies were busy swarming the various crashed vehicles, paying no attention to the 4 soldiers moving along the casino's exterior. The creatures seemed drawn to the noise and movement of trapped survivors rather than the military team. As they approached the front entrance of the Silver Moon Casino, several zombies poured out from the building's interior, drawn by the commotion in the street. Rather than engage the creatures and risk drawing more attention, Foster took a knee at the edge of the building, with the rest of his team following his lead. They waited in tense silence as the ghouls emerged and looked around, apparently trying to decide which direction to pursue. The creatures seemed confused by the multiple sources of noise and activity surrounding them. A block up the street, someone honked their car horn repeatedly, pulling the zombies' attention in that direction. Once the creatures had moved away from the casino entrance and put some distance between themselves and the soldiers, Foster signaled his team to resume movement. They rushed around the corner and into the casino, only to discover that the gaming floor was completely overrun with zombies. The interior space that had been chaotic earlier was now a nightmare landscape of feeding creatures and wandering ghouls. Foster was forced to fire off a couple of quick shots as zombies immediately began running toward their position. His marksmanship was true, dropping the closest threats, but the gunfire drew the attention of numerous other creatures throughout the casino. "Get to the front desk!" Foster shouted over the growing chorus of moans. The soldiers spotted the front desk area, approximately 30 yards to their left, and began moving in that direction. They fired additional shots to clear the closest zombies before sprinting across the open gaming floor. 2 zombies stood directly between the team and their destination, prompting Foster and Thomas to take point positions. They moved close together, which caused the pursuing zombies to bunch up in a similar formation. At the last moment, the 2 soldiers plowed through the creatures like fullbacks, clearing the way for a running back. The zombies went flying in opposite directions, hitting the carpeted ground hard and clearing the path for the team to continue their advance. As they reached the front desk, They vaulted over the marble counter in rapid succession. Most of the soldiers landed gracefully on the other side, but Sergeant Hansen's technique was less refined. He slid over the desktop surface and landed hard on the ground in what could only be described as a belly flop. "You're good, Sarge! You're good!" Foster called out as he grabbed his friend, who was gasping for air from the impact. Foster helped Hansen to his feet and pulled him into the back office area, shutting the door just as a throng of zombies began swarming the front desk area. Through the door's window, he could see the creatures pressing against the barrier, but they showed no inclination to climb over it. Each soldier collapsed onto the floor of the small office space, catching their breath after the intense sprint through the zombie-infested casino. "Well, that worked like a charm," Parker said with sarcasm, his chest still heaving from exertion. "What the hell are we supposed to do now?" Thomas asked, voicing what they were all thinking. Foster continued catching his breath while pulling out his radio and switching it to Melody's frequency. "Melody, do you copy?" He spoke into the device. "I read you, Captain. Can we go now?" she asked. Foster looked toward the office window, where zombies continued to pace back and forth beyond the front desk area. "Not yet. The road is blocked in both directions," he reported. There was a long pause before Melody responded, and Foster could hear the stress in her voice when she finally spoke. "So, what am I supposed to do?" she asked. "Just keep calm. I'll figure something out. Once I know what's going on, I'll be in touch," Foster replied, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "Thank you, Captain," Melody said before cutting the transmission. The radio went silent, and Foster's 3 soldiers looked at him expectantly, waiting for their leader to provide direction in what seemed like an impossible situation. "So, Foster, what's your bright idea?" Hansen asked. Foster leaned back against the office wall and let out a slow breath before answering. "As soon as I figure it out, I'll let you know." Chapter 10. Hours passed as the group of soldiers continued to sit in the cramped office space just behind the front desk. The sound of moaning continued unabated outside the door, serving as a constant reminder that they remained trapped in the zombie-infested casino. The office had no windows to the outside world, leaving them in artificial light that created an atmosphere more like a bunker than a temporary refuge. The small space was cluttered with typical office equipment, filing cabinets, a desk covered with paperwork, and a bulletin board covered with employee schedules that would never be followed again. The soldiers had arranged themselves around the room as comfortably as possible, but the extended wait was taking its toll on everyone's nerves. "What the hell time is it anyway?" Private Thomas asked, breaking the silence that had stretched on too long. Sergeant Hansen checked his watch and let out a weary sigh. "Nearly 6:30, he replied. "Have any of those things moved yet?" Parker asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. Foster got up from his seated position against the wall, his joints protesting after hours of remaining in the same cramped position. He moved carefully to the door and gently pulled it open a few inches, peering through the gap to assess their situation. He let out a frustrated sigh as he spotted half a dozen zombies still gathered at the front desk area, with another dozen or so scattered throughout the nearby slot machine section. The creatures showed no signs of losing interest in their location. "A few have decided to take up gambling, but most of them are still trying to check in," Foster reported. Foster closed the door and grabbed his radio, switching to Sullivan's frequency before keying the microphone. "Hey Sullivan, how's it looking over there?" he asked. "Not as bad as it was an hour ago, but still pretty bad," Sullivan's voice crackled back through the static. "Think you can make a run for it?" Foster pressed. "If we had to, but I'd like it more if those things were a little further away from us," Sullivan replied with caution. "I've been thinking about that. I think we can make that happen for you," Foster said. Sullivan's response came quickly, and Foster could hear the concern in his subordinate's voice. "Cap, I know what you're thinking, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let you sacrifice yourself for Cooper and I," Sullivan said firmly. Foster let out a laugh and shook his head, noting the worried looks that appeared on his men's faces at the mention of self-sacrifice. "Trust me, Sullivan, I wasn't about to sacrifice myself, at least not willingly," Foster replied. "So, what's your plan then?" Sullivan asked. "Parker has some of that plastic explosive we took from the armory," Foster explained. "I figured we'd set it up on the front desk and level everything in a 20-foot radius. That should pull those things away from you, and give us a path to get over to the stairs. I like it, Cap. It's a shame we don't have enough C4 to take out the traffic jam on the strip, Sullivan replied. Foster's eyes went wide as Sullivan's offhand comment triggered an idea that could solve multiple problems at once. The pieces of a larger plan began forming in his mind. I'll get back to you, Corporal. You just gave me one hell of an idea, Foster said with growing excitement. Glad I could help, Captain. We'll be ready to go when you are, Sullivan responded. Foster didn't reply, instead changing the frequency on his radio with a grin spreading across his face. His sudden shift in demeanor caught the attention of his men. Oh, Lord, I know that look, Sergeant Hanson said with resignation. Damn right you do, Hanson, Foster replied. Parker, get that explosive ready to go. I'm going to clear us a path. I'm on it, Foster, Parker said, already moving to prepare the charges. Foster clicked on the radio and switched to the base frequency. Nellis Base, this is Captain Foster. Do you copy? He spoke into the device. There was a long silence on the line that put Foster on edge. Nellis Base, do you copy? Foster repeated. Still no response came through the static. Damn it, Foster muttered under his breath. Maybe they've flown the coop already, Hanson suggested. Foster shook his head, unwilling to accept that possibility. Not likely, he replied. Foster changed the frequency again, broadening his call to any military personnel who might be monitoring the airwaves. He took a deep breath before clicking the transmit button. This is Captain Foster. Is anybody from Nellis receiving me? He called out. Another long silence followed, and Foster was about to try again when a voice finally came over the line. It was a younger man whose voice carried the weight of exhaustion and stress. This is Morgan. I'm on Nellis. What can I do for you, Captain? The voice replied. Foster felt a surge of relief at finally making contact with someone at the air base. Thank God, Morgan. My team is in a bit of a jam down here on the strip and need assistance, Foster explained. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, Captain, but there's no help here to give, Morgan said. Foster's heart sank, but he pressed for more information. Has everyone already evacuated? He asked. There was a long pause before Morgan spoke again, and when he did, his words carried implications that Foster didn't want to consider. Something like that, Captain, something like that, Morgan replied cryptically. Look, Morgan, I don't need a full strike team. I just need a chopper to clear the strip for us, Foster said. Sergeant Hanson gave Foster a mystified look at the suggestion. Foster released the transmit button so Morgan couldn't hear their conversation. Hey, if you got a better idea, Sarge, I'm all ears, Foster said defensively. Hanson shook his head with amusement at the audacity of his captain's plan. Nah, I'm good, Foster. Blowing up the strip seems a rational response to our situation, Hanson said with a laugh. Foster clicked the radio back on to continue his conversation with Morgan. So tell me, Morgan, is there at least one helicopter pilot left on base? Foster asked. Another long pause followed, as if Morgan was contemplating something difficult or dangerous. I'm a pilot, but I'm going to need a damn good reason, Morgan finally replied. I have a busload of civilians, people DC specifically requested we come out here and find. I don't know what their plan is, but these people are vital to it succeeding. If you don't clear the way for us, every single one of them are going to die, Foster explained. Morgan remained quiet for several moments, apparently weighing the risks and benefits of Foster's request. It's going to take me some time to get to my chopper, Morgan finally said. How long are we talking, Morgan? Foster pressed. It's going to take as long as it takes, Morgan replied. Morgan's tone carried hints of dismay and horror, as if there was something happening at the airbase that he wasn't sharing. Foster understood that pressing for details might jeopardize his cooperation, so he didn't pursue the issue. Thank you, Morgan, Foster said with appreciation. I'll let you know when I'm inbound. Morgan out, the pilot replied, before cutting the transmission. The radio went silent as Parker returned to the office area. All right, Cap, we're ready to rock out there, Parker announced. Foster didn't miss a beat, switching back to Sullivan's frequency and keying the microphone. All right, Sullivan, we're ready to move over here, but there's a change in plan, Foster said. Foster got up and walked over to a facility map hanging on the wall, studying the layout of the casino's upper floors as he looked for something he remembered seeing earlier. What's the change? Sullivan asked through the radio. We're not hitting the parking deck yet, Foster replied, tracing routes on the map with his finger. So, where are we going? Sullivan pressed. Foster found what he was looking for, a room positioned across from the walkway to the parking deck that would provide them with a safe space to lay low. "We're going up to the 5th floor. There's an employee lounge that's just across from the parking deck. We're going to hold there until the strip is clear," Foster explained. "Do I even want to know how you're pulling that off?" he asked. "Probably not, but I'll fill you in once we're on the 5th floor," Foster replied. "Sounds good, Captain." "We're moving on your signal," Sullivan confirmed. "Stay tuned because it's coming," Foster said before switching off the radio. Foster moved over to Parker, who held a detonator in his hands. The private tossed the device to his captain, while the others began overturning heavy desks to create protective cover in the small office space. "How much did you put down, Parker?" Foster asked. "Just enough to clear the area," Parker replied with professional confidence. Foster nodded his approval as everyone took positions behind the improvised barricades. "When this stuff goes off, we're going out the door and hauling ass to the stairwell. Hanson, you're on point," Foster instructed. "I'll get us there, Cap," Hanson confirmed. Foster looked around at his team, noting the mix of tension and readiness in their expressions. He powered on the detonator and paused for a moment before pressing the activation button. The explosion was deafening, rattling the walls of the small office and sending ceiling tiles crashing down around them. The blast wave hit them even through their cover, and they waited several moments for the debris to settle before emerging from their protective positions. "Let's move!" Hanson shouted over the ringing in their ears. Hanson grabbed the door handle and threw it open, rushing out into the casino with his rifle at the ready. He looked back toward where the front desk had been located, which was now obliterated by the explosion. Small fires burned throughout the area, where wooden planks and debris had been scattered by the blast. Body parts from the zombies that had been congregating around the desk littered the space, and creatures as far away as the slot machines were on the ground, struggling to get back to their feet after being knocked down by the shockwave. Hanson turned and began running toward the stairwell entrance with the other 3 soldiers close behind him. As he approached the stairwell door, a zombie staggered out from the concrete space, apparently drawn by the noise of the explosion. Hanson put it down with a single well-placed shot before continuing his advance. Within seconds, Hanson was in the stairwell, pressing his shoulder against the wall as he ascended the concrete steps. His rifle remained trained upward as he led the team up the enclosed corridor with tactical haste. To his relief, the stairwell appeared to be empty, at least up to the 5th floor level. Hanson paused beside the 5th floor door, preparing to throw it open but waiting for Foster's signal. The captain moved into position and gave him the go-ahead nod, then breached the doorway as Hanson cleared the way for the team's entry. Foster stepped out onto the 5th floor and spotted 2 zombies positioned off to the right side of the hallway. He wasted no time opening fire, dropping both creatures with precise headshots that eliminated the immediate threat. As Foster dealt with the zombies, Parker took the next position in their formation and led the group down the carpeted hallway toward the parking deck walkway. The 5th floor consisted primarily of restaurants and shops that had been closed for the evening, making foot traffic essentially non-existent. The team maintained their pace as they moved through the area, keeping the walkway in sight, while Foster looked for the employee area he'd spotted on the facility map. He found the door on the right side of the hallway and pulled out the master key card that Melody had programmed for them. Foster swiped the card, and the electronic lock clicked open with a beep. He pushed inside and quickly swept the room to ensure it was clear of threats. The space was a typical employee break area with a few vending machines in the corner, a small kitchen area with basic appliances, and several tables and chairs. It was sparse but would serve their purposes. "Sergeant, keep an eye out for Sullivan and Cooper," Foster instructed. "No need, they're coming down the hall right now," Hanson replied, spotting the 2 soldiers approaching their position. Hanson held the door open as Sullivan and Cooper sprinted down the hallway toward their position. Even though they knew nothing was actively pursuing them, both men moved with haste. "Come on, boys, get in here," Hanson called out encouragingly. Hanson stepped back to allow Sullivan and Cooper entry into the break room. After securing the door behind them, he joined the others who were taking seats around the room, everyone breathing heavily from their exertions and the adrenaline of their escape. Sullivan and Cooper looked around at their teammates, receiving welcoming nods from everyone who was glad to see their friends had made it safely to the rendezvous point. The reunion was brief but meaningful, given what they'd all been through. "So what's the deal, Cap?" "What's the plan?" Sullivan asked. Foster settled into one of the break room chairs, looking more relaxed than he had in hours. "Well, Sullivan, the plan for the moment is to sit back and get ourselves a snack," Foster replied, gesturing toward the vending machines. "Because clearing the strip is out of our hands. Until that happens, all we can do is wait." Chapter 11. Melody rested her head on the steering wheel of the bus as the civilians from the engineering conference tried to get comfortable behind her in the cramped seats. The sun had been up for several hours now, climbing steadily toward its 9:30 position in the desert sky, and the harsh daylight revealed just how packed the strip had become with abandoned vehicles and wandering zombies. Through the bus's large windshield, Melody could see cars stretched across the entire roadway in both directions, creating an impenetrable maze of twisted metal and shattered glass. Dozens of zombies moved between the vehicles, clawing at windows and doors as they tried to break inside to reach the survivors trapped within. The creatures showed no sign of fatigue or loss of interest, maintaining their relentless assault on anything that might contain human prey. Even though Melody could only see a small portion of the road from their concealed position, she understood that this same scene was likely playing out across the entire length of the strip. The famous boulevard that had once been a symbol of excess and entertainment had become a death trap for anyone foolish enough to venture onto it. Behind her, the conference attendees were growing increasingly restless after hours of confinement in the bus. The stress of their situation was beginning to show in various ways. Some people were crying quietly, others were fidgeting constantly, and a few were becoming openly agitated. "Is there any word yet? I don't know how much longer I can stand just sitting here," one man called out from the middle of the bus. Melody pulled her head off the steering wheel and turned around to face the complaining passenger. Her customer service voice was long gone, replaced by the hardened tone of someone who had been through too much to tolerate unnecessary drama. "Hey, suck it up. We're all in this shit together," she said, with steel in her voice. "The captain will call when there's something worth calling about." She stared down the man with an intensity that conveyed years of dealing with difficult customers, but magnified by their life or death circumstances. The passenger could see the rage burning in her eyes, and he quickly sat back in his seat and shut up, rather than risk further confrontation. A few tense moments later, the radio clip to Melody's belt crackled to life with Foster's familiar voice. "Melody, do you copy?" came through the static. Melody continued glaring at the man, who had complained for another few seconds, hammering home her point about keeping quiet, before grabbing the radio and responding. "I read you, Captain," she said into the device. "I just heard from my guy. The strip is going to be cleared really soon." Foster's voice carried a mixture of relief and apprehension. Melody felt her pulse quicken at the news, though she wasn't sure how such an impossible task could be accomplished. "But how?" she asked. "There are 2 attack helicopters inbound. They're going to do what they can from the air, but you're going to need to watch yourself, because there's going to be a lot of debris," Foster explained. Melody was speechless as the implications of Foster's words sank in. The thought of all those people trapped in the cars being blown up just so her group could escape was horrifying, even if it was their only chance of survival. She remained silent for too long, processing the moral complexity of their situation. "I know, Melody, I'm not thrilled with it either, but this is the only way," Foster said. Melody took a deep breath and forced herself to accept the reality of their circumstances. She had learned over the past several hours that survival sometimes required making impossible choices. "Okay, Captain, I trust you. As soon as the road is clear, I'll get these people to the stadium," she said after keying the microphone. "Thank you, Melody," Foster replied. "I'll see you soon, Captain," Melody said, hoping her words would prove true. "Let's hope so," Foster replied. The radio went silent, and Melody started up the bus engine, letting it idle while she prepared for what was about to happen. The diesel motor rumbled beneath her, providing a steady vibration that she found oddly comforting. A few minutes passed in tense silence before she heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters approaching from the direction of the strip. The rhythmic beating of rotor blades grew steadily louder, creating a mechanical thunder that seemed to fill the air around them. Melody flinched involuntarily, as did most of the passengers behind her, when the miniguns mounted on the helicopters spun up and began sending thousands of rounds per minute into the cars and zombies on the roadway. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard, a mechanical screaming that seemed to tear the air itself. Sparks flew in all directions as armor-piercing bullets tore through vehicle frames, while shrapnel and zombified body parts filled the air in a grotesque display of destruction. The sustained firepower was overwhelming, turning the traffic jam into a field of twisted metal and carnage within seconds. A few moments later, several rockets launched from hardpoints beneath the helicopters, their contrails drawing white lines across the blue sky before the missiles impacted multiple targets on the roadway below. The explosions sent flames and thick black smoke billowing into the air, creating a nerve-rattling cacophony. The attack continued for what felt like hours, but in reality was only seconds, with the helicopters systematically destroying every vehicle and creature they could identify as a threat. The noise was so intense that Melody could feel it in her chest, and several of the conference attendees covered their ears in pain. It took several long seconds after the attack ended for the smoke to clear enough for Melody to see that there was now a navigable path through what had once been an impenetrable obstacle. The strip looked like a war zone, but it was passable. "Hang on, everybody!" Melody shouted to her passengers. Melody threw the bus into drive and hit the gas pedal hard, feeling the large vehicle respond with surprising acceleration. The bus picked up speed as she made the turn onto the heavily damaged strip, navigating between crater-sized potholes and chunks of debris. Bullet holes pockmarked the asphalt surface, and large pieces of what used to be cars were scattered throughout the roadway, some still burning with orange flames that sent black smoke into the morning sky. The destruction was total and horrifying, but it had created the escape route they desperately needed. She kept the accelerator pressed to the floor, ramming through several pieces of wreckage that blocked their path as they pushed through the devastation. The bus shuddered with each impact, but the heavy vehicle's construction allowed it to bulldoze through obstacles that would have stopped smaller vehicles. Zombies began pouring out from some of the open casino entrances, drawn by the noise of the bus engine and the movement on the previously static roadway. But the creatures were no match for the momentum of the speeding bus as it plowed through the few that made it onto the road. Melody managed to get them clear of the downtown area, making a sharp turn to the south on a side street that led away from the strip. She kept her focus forward, deliberately ignoring the apocalyptic scenes playing out at the businesses and side streets they passed. Behind her, she could hear audible gasps and crying coming from the passengers as they witnessed the destruction surrounding them. But Melody didn't have time to provide comfort or reassurance. She had to get them to the stadium, and that single objective consumed all of her attention. She maintained their speed until they were several miles away from the downtown area, only then allowing herself to grab the radio and attempt contact with their destination. Come in stadium," she spoke into the device. A male voice responded through the static after a moment's delay. "Who is this?" the soldier asked. "My name is Melody, and I have a busload of VIPs. Where do I go?" she replied. "Hold on," the voice said before the transmission cut out. Melody continued driving while awaiting instructions, slowing down as she approached within a mile of the stadium complex. She was still unsure of exactly where to go, and didn't want to arrive before knowing. After several tense moments, a different voice came over the radio, this one female and more authoritative. "This is Becky. Who is this?" the woman asked. "Is this the stadium?" Melody replied. "Yes, I'm at the stadium. Who is this?" Becky confirmed. Melody glanced in the side mirror and felt her heart sink when she saw dozens of zombies running after the bus, apparently having caught up after she slowed down. The creatures were gaining ground with each passing second. "I got a bus full of VIPs and we're headed your way. You better get ready because we're going to be coming in hot," Melody announced into the radio. She pressed the accelerator again, knowing they would need some distance from the pursuing zombies if they were going to have time to evacuate the bus safely once they reached the stadium. "Okay, I see you. Just pull up to the stadium anywhere you can. We'll get you out from the second-story walkway." Becky's voice came back with reassuring confidence. "I'm going straight for the front, so get ready," Melody replied. As she approached the stadium complex, Melody could see a handful of wrecked cars blocking the entrance to the parking lot. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, wanting to ensure it stayed straight as she lined up the front end of the bus with the obstacles. The bus slammed into the abandoned vehicles with tremendous force, tossing them aside like toys as the heavy vehicle's momentum carried them through the blockade. Melody kept pressing forward, determined to get her passengers to safety. After a few more moments of careful maneuvering, she could see a handful of people waving at her from the second-floor walkway that circled the stadium. Melody drove carefully now, slowing to a crawl as she positioned the bus alongside the stadium structure. Through her mirrors, she could hear a few gunshots popping off behind them, and she saw zombies falling to the ground as the stadium's defenders engaged the pursuing creatures. She threw the bus into park and cut the engine before getting up from the driver's seat and marching toward the back of the vehicle. Before she could reach the emergency hatch, she heard footsteps moving across the roof of the bus, followed by the sound of the hatch being opened from above. A moment later, the opening was filled by a couple of soldiers looking down into the bus interior. "Okay, who is the one who called on the radio?" one of the soldiers asked. "That's me," Melody replied, raising her hand. "Give me your hand. I'm going to pull you up. The rest of you hang tight. We're getting some ladders to get you out of here," the soldier instructed. There were a few cheers coming from the conference attendees as they realized their ordeal was finally over. Melody felt strong hands grab her arms and lift her up through the hatch onto the bus roof. Once on top of the vehicle, the soldier pointed toward another couple of soldiers who were positioned to boost her up to the stadium's elevated walkway. "Thank you," Melody said with heartfelt appreciation. Melody made her way over to the waiting soldiers, who lifted her up and over the stadium's exterior wall. As she got her footing on the walkway, a woman and a soldier, who appeared to be in charge, walked over to greet her. "I'm Becky, this is Captain Thompson," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Melody," she replied, shaking hands with both of them. Captain Thompson looked her up and down, with the appraising eye of a military professional. "Well, Melody, I must say you make one hell of an entrance," he said with admiration. "You should have seen the escape," she replied. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "The Silver Moon Casino on the Strip," Melody replied. Becky and Thompson exchanged a curious glance that suggested this information was significant to them. "I don't suppose you saw the explosion a few minutes ago, did you?" Captain Thompson asked. "From what I was told, a couple of helicopters cleared a traffic jam on the Strip," Melody explained. The duo again exchanged meaningful glances, apparently trying to process the implications of what Melody was telling them about the helicopter strike. "Thank you for that information. Can you tell me who these people are?" Becky asked, gesturing toward the bus where the evacuation was continuing. "And how you knew to bring them here?" Captain Thompson added. "Sure, these are attendees of an engineering conference. Captain Foster and his team was sent to retrieve them and bring them here," Melody explained. Captain Thompson's expression grew more serious at the mention of Foster's name. "And where is Captain Foster?" he asked. "He's with his team back at the hotel," Melody replied. Becky looked confused by this information. "You left them behind?" she asked with concern. Melody shook her head emphatically. "They ordered me to, because their primary targets weren't with this group," she explained. "Who were the primary targets?" Becky pressed. "The keynote speakers. One of them is a local, and Captain Foster seemed intent on getting to them," Melody said. Becky and Captain Thompson let out worried sighs before stepping over to the edge of the stadium walkway, motioning for Melody to join them. From their elevated position, they could see out over the parking lot and the surrounding area. What they saw was deeply troubling. 100 zombies were emerging from the outer edges of the complex, streaming in from the surrounding neighborhoods in a steady flow of undead humanity. It was clear that the noise and activity of their arrival had drawn attention from across a wide area. The stream of creatures showed no sign of diminishing, and they all understood that the situation would only get worse as time passed. "Well, let's hope they find the keynote speakers soon," Captain Thompson said grimly, "because I don't know how long they're going to have to get here safely." The end.